The telegram arrived 3 days before Clara Whitmore was supposed to become someone's wife. It didn't come from Ethan Caldwell. It came from his neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Holt, who had apparently watched the whole ugly business from across the fence and decided someone ought to warn the poor girl before she dragged herself and her baby halfway across the country for nothing. He ain't coming, the telegram read. Found himself a local girl. Married her last Tuesday. Thought you should know before you made the trip. Clara read it twice. Then she put it face down on the kitchen table, picked up her daughter Lily from the wicker basket on the floor, and stood at the window for a long time without saying anything. She had already sold most of her furniture. She had already given up her room at Mrs. Patton's boarding house. She had already told everyone she was leaving. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the moment you realize you have nothing left to go back to. Clara Whitmore knew that silence the way she knew the weight of Lily against her shoulder, completely, in her bones, without any possibility of pretending otherwise. She was 24 years old. She had a 6-month-old daughter whose father had disappeared before Lily drew her first breath. She had $17, a leather suitcase that had belonged to her mother, and a one-way train ticket to Billings, Montana, purchased with money she could not get back. Ethan Caldwell had been, in retrospect, too good on paper. His letters were careful and considered, full of descriptions of Silver Creek and the valley and the way the light hit the mountains in the early morning. He had never once mentioned love. He had spoken of partnership, of practical arrangements, of needing someone capable and steady for the hard work of frontier life. At the time, Clara had found that honesty refreshing. Now she found it chilling, because a man who thought of marriage as a practical arrangement would have no particular trouble rearranging his plans when a more convenient option appeared. She could have stayed in Boston. That was the truth she had to live with. She could have swallowed her pride and asked her aunt for help, could have found another position as a bookkeeper, could have figured something out. The city was hard on women alone with children, but it wasn't impossible. But she had wanted out. That was the part she couldn't explain to anyone without sounding either foolish or desperate. She had wanted out of Boston and out of the life that had quietly collapsed around her, and out of the particular exhaustion of being looked at with pity by people who had known her before everything went wrong. She burned the telegram in the kitchen stove. Then she packed the rest of her things and boarded the train west. The journey took 4 days. Lily was sick for most of it, not seriously, but persistently, with the kind of low-grade misery that makes a baby cry in short, exhausted bursts and makes her mother sleep in 15-minute intervals whenever she wasn't nursing or rocking or walking the narrow train aisle at 3 in the morning while other passengers glared from their berths. Clara ate little. She spent the daylight hours watching the landscape change through the window, the flat gray cities giving way to open farmland, then to something wider and more serious, then to the particular severity of the northern plains. And she tried not to think about what she was going to do when she arrived. She had written to Ethan's neighbor, Mrs. Holt, asking if there was a boarding house or a hotel in Billings where a woman traveling alone might stay for a reasonable price. She had received no reply. Either the letter hadn't arrived in time or Mrs. Holt's interest in Clara's welfare ended at the telegram. By the time the train pulled into Billings through a curtain of driving rain, Clara had exhausted her supply of patience and was operating purely on something that wasn't quite courage, more like the absence of any remaining alternative. The platform was nearly empty. 2 men in heavy coats moved through the rain toward the station doors. A station hand pushed a luggage cart without looking at anything. The few other passengers who had disembarked hurried past her into the dry warmth inside. Clara stood under the narrow overhang of the platform roof and held Lily against her chest and looked out at the town and let herself understand very plainly that no one was coming for her. She had half expected it. She had been preparing herself for it since she burned the telegram. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your body while rain soaks through your wedding dress, she had put on the dress in a stubborn, stupid act of defiance. 3 stops back, thinking she would arrive looking like she had a right to be there, are 2 entirely different experiences, and Clara was not too proud to admit, at least to herself, that she stood on that platform for several minutes and simply shook. Lily whimpered against her collarbone. Clara pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head. "I know," she said quietly. "I know. Give me a minute." The station agent was a stout man named Garvey, with a permanent squint and the demeanor of someone who had long ago decided that other people's problems were not his responsibility. Clara came inside dripping and stood at his window. She asked him if there was a hotel nearby that was decent and not too expensive. He told her the Hargrove Hotel was 2 blocks east and cost 60 cents a night. And then he looked at Lily and looked at Clara's ruined dress and looked back at his ledger as if he had already forgotten she existed. "Is there any other woman traveling through tonight?" Clara asked. "Or anyone waiting for a passenger from Boston?" "Nobody waiting," Garvey said without looking up. "Had a fellow come in this morning asking if a woman with a baby had arrived yet. Told him no. He left, didn't come back." Clara's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. "What did he look like?" Garvey shrugged. Tall, brown coat, had the look of somebody who didn't want to be there. She almost asked more. Then she decided she didn't want the answer. If Ethan Caldwell had come to the station, if he had come once and found her not yet arrived and decided that was sufficient, then she was done thinking about Ethan Caldwell. Whatever small, painful part of her had still been hoping he would appear and explain himself, she put that part away now like a letter she wasn't going to answer. She thanked Garvey and went back out into the rain. The Hargrove Hotel was full. The woman at the desk, narrow-faced, with hair pinned so tightly it seemed to be pulling her expression into something permanent and unwelcoming, informed Clara that every room was taken by a party of land surveyors who had come through 2 days ago and showed no signs of leaving. "Do you know anywhere else?" Clara asked. "There's the Miller place, but she only takes women she knows." "I don't know anyone here." "That's what I figured," the woman said, and her tone wasn't cruel exactly, just the particular flatness of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything. Clara stood in the doorway of the hotel with rain blowing in behind her, and Lily starting to cry in earnest now, not the tired whimpering of before, but the genuine outraged cry of a baby who was cold and wet and had reached the end of her tolerance. Clara rocked her automatically, the motion so ingrained by now it happened without thought. She tried to calculate. She had $17. The train ticket had taken almost everything else. She could not afford to waste money on bad decisions, which meant she needed to be smart. And being smart when you were soaked through and your baby was screaming and you hadn't slept properly in 4 days required a particular kind of effort. The woman at the desk was watching her with an expression that had shifted slightly from flatness toward something almost sympathetic. "There's a covered area around back," she offered. "Out of the rain. Some women have waited there." "Waited for what?" The woman paused. "For someone to come along." Clara looked at her. "I've been waiting for someone to come along," she said. "It doesn't seem to be working." She went back outside. She found the overhang around the back of the hotel, a wide wooden roof over what had probably been a loading area, and stood under it and tried to think. The rain was steadying now, no longer the violent downpour it had been, but a cold, settled, determined kind of rain that suggested it intended to continue for a while. Lily had quieted to a low, miserable fussing. Clara held her inside her coat, sharing warmth, and went through her options one more time. She could go back to the station. Garvey had shown no particular interest in helping her, but the station itself was dry, and she could wait there until morning and figure out next steps in daylight. That felt like the most reasonable choice. She could ask the hotel woman for advice on who in town might have a room to let. Strangers sometimes helped strangers. Not often, but sometimes. She could, and this was the thought she kept pushing away because it required a kind of surrender. She wasn't ready for. She could send a telegram to her aunt in Boston and ask for money for a return ticket. She was working through the specific awfulness of that third option when she heard hoofbeats. Not the busy sound of town traffic. She'd gotten used to that on the platform. But one horse, moving deliberately through the street, slowing as it approached the alley beside the hotel. A man's voice said something low and quiet, the kind of voice that talks to horses the way other men don't bother. Then the horse stopped. Then a man came around the corner into the overhang's dim shelter and stopped when he saw her and looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read in the low light, somewhere between surprise and the particular stillness of someone deciding something. I was broad through the shoulders, wearing a heavy canvas coat that was dark with rain. He had several days of beard and the kind of weathered face that didn't give away much. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, though it was hard to say. He had eyes that were currently fixed on Lily with an attention that might have been unnerving if it hadn't been accompanied by the fact that he was making absolutely no move toward either of them. "Evening," he said. "Evening," Clara said. A pause. rain against the overhang. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. "I was," Clara said. "I've given up on that." He nodded slowly, as if this was a reasonable answer he had heard before. Then he said, "The hotel's full." "I know. There's nothing else in town that'll take a woman alone with a baby. Not tonight." He wasn't saying it to be cruel. He was saying it the way you say a fact you'd rather not be true. "Mrs. Miller down on Cottonwood won't open her door after dark." "I know that too," Clara said, though she hadn't, until now. Another pause. He looked at Lily, who had gone quiet, watching him with the solemn attention of a baby encountering something new. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles out," he said. "Silver Creek. Got a spare room and a cook who'll be up early." He stopped. Then, as if he felt the inadequacy of what he'd offered, he added, "The room locks from the inside." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was measuring things she had no good instruments for. The reliability of a stranger in a dark alley in a town she didn't know, against the reality of standing in the rain with a sick baby until morning. "What's your name?" she asked. "Wyatt Mercer." "Are you a dangerous man, Mr. Mercer?" Something crossed his face that might have been amusement if it had allowed itself to go further. "Some people think so." "Why?" "Because I don't do what I'm expected to," he said, "and I don't let people take what's mine." Clara considered this. "That doesn't sound dangerous to me," she said. "That sounds like someone with standards." He didn't say anything to that. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. "This is my daughter Lily. I arrived on the 4 o'clock train, and the man who was supposed to meet me didn't come. I have $17 and no plan." "That's an honest accounting," Wyatt said. "I found that pretending you have more than you do makes everything worse," Clara said. "I'll take you up on the room. I want to be clear that I'm not looking for charity. I'll work for my stay until I figure out what I'm doing next." Wyatt looked at her. He looked at Lily. He looked at the rain. "All right," he said. "You can ride up front, Sab." The ride to Silver Creek was cold and mostly silent. Clara held Lily inside her coat with one arm and gripped the saddle horn with her other hand and concentrated on staying upright and not shaking so visibly that it became embarrassing. The horse moved steadily through the dark, and Wyatt rode behind her with enough distance that she didn't feel crowded, and she was grateful for that, and also grateful that he didn't seem to feel the need to fill the silence with conversation. She had met too many men who couldn't tolerate quiet, who filled it with opinions or reassurances or questions that were really just ways of making the situation about themselves. Wyatt Mercer rode 4 miles through a cold rain without saying a word, and Clara decided this was the first good sign she'd encountered since Boston. She tried to remember the last time she'd made a genuinely good decision. It had been a while. The pregnancy had been the result of trusting a man who turned out not to be trustworthy. She didn't blame herself for that anymore, or at least she was working on not blaming herself anymore. And then she had spent the following months making a series of small, desperate choices that seemed reasonable in the moment and looked questionable in retrospect. The letters to Ethan had begun as one of those choices. A mail-order arrangement, her aunt had said, in a tone that managed to convey disgust and pity simultaneously. "That's what you've been reduced to." Clara had not told her aunt about the telegram. She had not told anyone. She had gotten on the train because she had nothing to go back to, and because the alternative, accepting that she had made 2 large mistakes in 1 year, was more than she could absorb at once. She thought about this as the horse moved through the dark. She thought about how she had arrived in Montana in a wedding dress she'd made herself, which she'd thought was either brave or idiotic, and was now fairly certain was idiotic. She thought about Lily, who had fallen asleep against her chest with the total confidence of someone who had decided the situation was under control. She thought about the room that locked from the inside. Small mercies, she told herself. You count small mercies. Silver Creek Ranch came into view as a collection of yellow light against the dark. Windows lit in the main house, a lamp over the barn door, the general impression of a place that was being actively maintained by someone who took it seriously. It was larger than she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something small and barely functional, maybe. The frontier property of her imagination rather than the actual working ranch in front of her. The house was 2 stories, solidly built, with a porch that wrapped around the front and a second structure behind it that was probably a bunkhouse. There were fenced fields on either side of the approach road that suggested organization and planning. Whoever Wyatt Mercer was, he was not a man barely scraping by. She filed that away as something worth understanding later. He helped her down from the horse, kept it brief, practical, one hand at her elbow for exactly as long as necessary, and led her up to the front porch. Before he could open the door, it swung inward, and a woman appeared in the light. She was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair and the compact, efficient bearing of someone who runs a kitchen and considers it the most important room in any building. She looked at Clara. She looked at Lily. She looked at Wyatt. "Found her at the hotel," Wyatt said. "She needs the spare room." The woman, whose name, as Clara would learn, was Irene Paskey, and who had cooked at Silver Creek for 11 years, looked at Clara for another 3 seconds. Then she stepped back and held the door open. "The baby's cold," she said. "Give her here and I'll warm her up. There's soup on the stove." Clara had been holding herself together by a very thin thread for the last several hours. The instruction to give the baby here and the information that there was soup on the stove were, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, the thing that frayed that thread most dangerously. She handed Lily over. It was an act of trust she wouldn't have expected herself to perform with a stranger, but Irene took the baby with the automatic competence of someone who had held many babies and was not going to drop this one, and followed her inside. The front room was warm and lit and entirely ordinary and felt, to Clara, like the most significant room she had ever entered. She ate the soup. Irene fed Lily some warm broth with a small spoon, and Lily accepted it with the suspicious cooperation of someone who would prefer to be objected, but admitted it was better than being hungry. Wyatt sat across the table and drank coffee and didn't ask her any questions, which she appreciated more than she could say. It was Irene who spoke first, and she did it with the directness of someone who had decided that dancing around things was a waste of time. "You're the bride who came on the train," Irene said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Clara said. "And he didn't show up." "No." Irene made a sound in her throat that communicated several things simultaneously: contempt for the unnamed man, sympathy for Clara, and a general assessment of male behavior that she had long since stopped being surprised by. "The same thing happened to my sister's friend back in '68. Man promised her everything on paper and had a wife already when she arrived." She paused. "What do you plan to do?" "I haven't gotten that far yet," Clara said honestly. "What can you do?" Clara looked up at her. "I can keep books. I managed accounts for 2 merchants in Boston and balanced the records for a small manufacturing operation the year before things changed. I can cook adequately, though not particularly well. I can sew, I can teach. I have 2 years of a college education, which is 2 more than most people where I come from." She paused. "I can work hard. I know that sounds like something everyone says, but in my case, it happens to be true because I don't have the option of doing anything else." Irene looked at her steadily. "You don't want to go back to Boston?" "No." "Pride?" Irene said, not unkindly. "In part," Clara admitted, "and in part because there's nothing there for me anymore. The version of my life that existed in Boston is gone. I'd rather figure out a new one than go back and try to fit into a shape that doesn't work." Irene absorbed this. She looked at Wyatt. Wyatt was looking at Clara with an expression she still couldn't quite read. He had been quiet for most of this exchange, letting Irene run the conversation, which she suspected was probably his usual arrangement. "We've had some trouble with the books," he said. Not offering her a job, just stating something true. "What kind of trouble?" He picked up his coffee. "The kind where the numbers don't line up and I can't find out why." Clara looked at him. "That's either an accounting error or someone is stealing from you." Wyatt looked back at her. "That's exactly what I suspect," he said. "Us." Irene showed her to the spare room. It was simple. A bed with a clean quilt, a washstand, a small dresser with a mirror, a window that faced the fields. The lock was a solid iron bolt that Clara shot home the moment Irene left. She set Lily down on the bed and unwrapped her from the layers of damp cloth and checked her carefully in the lamplight, color, breathing, the warmth of her forehead. Lily looked back at her with the dark, solemn eyes she'd had since birth and reached up and grabbed Clara's finger. "We're all right," Clara told her. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and let herself be, for exactly 90 seconds, completely terrified. It was the deal she had made with herself somewhere around the second day on the train. She would not spend all her time being frightened. She would allow herself some amount of it, a specific bounded amount, and then she would stop and make the next decision. 90 seconds. Then she lowered her hands and looked at the bolt on the door and the clean quilt on the bed and the lamp burning on the dresser. She still had no plan. But she had a room, and her baby was warm, and there was soup in her stomach, and the man who had brought her here had a problem with his accounting that sounded like something she could actually solve. Small mercies. She pulled Lily close and lay down on top of the quilt without undressing and closed her eyes and was asleep within 3 minutes. She woke before the sun. The habit was one she'd developed in Boston without ever deciding to. Lily woke early and hungry, and that was simply how mornings worked now. She nursed her in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch coming to life outside. Boots on the wooden steps of the bunkhouse, the low voices of ranch hands, the distant movement of animals. A working ranch in the early morning had a specific kind of sound, she realized, that was entirely different from a city waking up. Less noise, more purpose. By the time she had cleaned herself up as best she could with the washstand water and changed Lily into dry clothes from her suitcase, she could smell coffee coming up through the floorboards. She unlocked the bolt and went downstairs. Irene was at the stove, and 3 ranch hands were at the table eating breakfast, and they all stopped and looked at her when she came in. She had changed out of the ruined wedding dress. She'd scrubbed it last night with cold water and draped it over the dresser without much hope, and was wearing a plain brown wool dress that was warm and decent and entirely unpretentious. The ranch hand's expressions ranged from curious to skeptical. One of them, a young man with red hair and the look of someone who had formed an opinion before she even opened her mouth, looked at Lily and then at Clara's left hand and noted the absence of a wedding ring with the obviousness of someone who wanted her to know he'd noticed. Clara looked back at him without expression. "Good morning," she said. To the room in general. Irene handed her a cup of coffee. "This is Pete, Harlow, and Dunk," she said, indicating the 3 men in order. "They work the cattle and the fence lines." To the men she said, "This is Mrs. Whitmore. She'll be staying on for a bit." "Miss," Clara corrected, because she'd decided the previous night to stop pretending. The pretense served no one. The red-haired one, Pete, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "You got something to say, Pete?" Irene said without turning from the stove. Pete did not, apparently, have something to say. Wyatt came in through the back door at that moment, coat damp, having already been out in the fields for what looked like hours. He took the coffee Irene handed him and stood at the counter and looked at the table. "Clara," he said, "after breakfast, if you want to look at the books, they're in the office." The 3 ranch hands all looked at Wyatt, then at Clara, then back at Wyatt. "She said she can manage accounts," Wyatt said to their collective unspoken objection. "We haven't been able to figure out where the money's been going for 3 months. Figure it's worth trying something different." Pete opened his mouth. "Don't," Irene said. Pete closed his mouth. Clara drank her coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the ranch coming fully into the gray morning light, and thought that she had arrived in Montana with nothing but a ruined dress and a baby and $17 and a complete absence of any good options. She was beginning to suspect this might turn out to be more complicated than she had expected. Whether that was better or worse than the alternative, she had not yet decided. The office was a small room off the main hallway, more crowded with paper than furniture. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet with 1 drawer that wouldn't close properly, and approximately 3 months of ledgers stacked in a pile that communicated more clearly than words that someone had been avoiding this room. Wyatt stood in the doorway while Clara stood at the desk and looked at it all. "The last man who did the books was a fellow named Garrett," Wyatt said. "Left in the spring. Said he had family business in Oregon." "Did he?" Clara asked. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "At the time I believed him." Clara picked up the top ledger, flipped through several pages. The entries were neat and consistent in Garrett's careful hand, too consistent, in the way that numbers sometimes were when someone was working hard to make them look right, rather than actually getting them right. "Has anything run short?" she asked. "Supplies, feed, anything where you paid for something and felt like you got less than you ordered?" Wyatt's jaw moved. "Twice this spring with the feed order. Thompson at the mills said there was a shortage, that the order was smaller than I remembered. Did you have Garrett's record of what you'd ordered? Garrett said he hadn't written it down yet. Clara looked at the ledger. Then she looked at Wyatt. When did Garrett leave for Oregon? Wyatt stood very still. About a week after the second feed order. Clara put the ledger down and pulled the second one from the pile. Give me 2 days with these, she said. Don't tell anyone what I'm looking for. Why not? Because if there's someone on this ranch who's been feeding information out, I'd rather they not know I'm looking until I know what I've found. Wyatt looked at her with that same unreadable expression he'd had on the hotel overhang the night before. She was starting to understand that it wasn't blankness. It was the face of someone who was thinking carefully about what he was seeing and hadn't yet reached a conclusion. All right, he said. He pulled the door mostly closed behind him as he left. Clara sat down at the desk and opened the first ledger to the beginning and began to read. Outside, the rain had stopped. The morning light was coming in cold and clear through the single window, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses was kicking at its stall in a regular, irritated rhythm, and Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in Montana with nothing and no plan, began the very careful work of finding out where the money had gone. She was not yet certain she was going to find anything useful. She was not yet certain she was safe here, or welcome here, or anything other than a woman who had made a series of questionable decisions and arrived at a stranger's table. But her hands were steady, her mind was clear. She had faced worse than a pile of dishonest ledgers. And somewhere in the house, Lily was sleeping in the care of a woman named Irene, who had taken her with the automatic competence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. And that, Clara decided, was enough to start with. She found the first discrepancy on the afternoon of the second day. It was not dramatic. The numbers didn't announce themselves or leap off the page. It was a single feed entry from February, written in Garrett's careful hand, that listed a payment of $42 to a supplier called Hartwell & Sons. The amount matched the receipt clipped to the page. The date matched. Everything matched. Except that in the supply log she'd found in the bottom drawer, a separate book, handwritten by Wyatt himself, the kind of rough daily record a man keeps out of habit rather than accounting discipline. The same delivery was listed as $31. $11. She sat back in the chair and looked at the two numbers for a long time. $11 was not a fortune. On its own, it meant almost nothing. But she had been doing this long enough to know that a man who inflates one entry by $11 doesn't stop at one entry. She turned back to January. She turned back to December. She pulled out the third ledger, which covered the previous spring, and started from the beginning. It took her until nearly midnight. With Lily sleeping in a crate Irene had padded with a folded quilt and set in the corner of the office, before she had the full picture. Over 14 months, Garrett had siphoned just under $400 from Silver Creek Ranch through a series of small, patient adjustments. Supply inflations, false service charges, 2 complete fabrications for work that had never been done. Each individual entry was small enough to seem like a rounding error. Together they were methodical, deliberate. The work of someone who had understood exactly how much attention Wyatt paid to his books, which was apparently not enough, and had made use of that gap. She sat with the total for a moment. Then she got up, went into the hallway, and knocked on the door to the room Wyatt used as a sitting room in the evenings. He answered immediately, which meant he hadn't been sleeping. He was still dressed, a book open face down on the chair behind him, and he looked at her expression and didn't say anything. "You want to come look at something?" she said. He came. She laid it out for him at the desk, the supply log against the ledger entries, the discrepancies circled in pencil, the running total she'd worked out at the bottom of a separate sheet in her own handwriting. She walked him through it methodically, not quickly, because she wanted him to see each piece rather than just the conclusion. Wyatt stood at her shoulder and read. His face did not change much, but his breathing did. In the way breathing changes when something confirms what you already suspected, and the confirmation is worse than you'd let yourself fully imagine. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Garrett," he said. "Yes." "I knew something wasn't right," he said. "I didn't know how to find it." "It was designed not to be found," Clara said. "He was careful. If you'd had someone looking at both the ledger and the supply log side by side from the beginning, he couldn't have done it. But most ranches don't keep the two records separately, and he knew you wouldn't compare them." Wyatt picked up the sheet with her totals, looked at the number at the bottom, put it back down. Almost $400, he said. 387, she said. Over 14 months. He stood there for another moment. Then he said quietly and without any particular drama, I'd like to wring his neck. That's understandable, Clara said, but he's in Oregon, and I don't think that's a productive use of your energy. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. What would you suggest? I'd suggest you let me set up a proper system so it can't happen again, she said. And I'd suggest you think about whether Garrett was working alone or whether someone here gave him information about your habits. Wyatt looked at her. You think one of my men was involved? I think you should consider it, Clara said carefully. You told me the feed orders came up short twice. Thompson at the mill said the orders were smaller than you remembered. If Garrett told someone at the mill what to say, Thompson was part of it. But it's also possible someone here told Garrett what he could get away with, how often you checked the books, how much you trusted the supplier receipts. The room was very quiet. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving through the trees along the creek. Pete, Wyatt said finally. Not a question. Clara didn't answer that. She didn't know enough yet. I think you should be careful, she said, and I think you should keep this between the two of us until you're ready to act on it. He nodded slowly. How long have you been thinking about this? Since this morning, she admitted. I wasn't sure until I had the total. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. He looked at her for a moment, that same measuring look she'd gotten from him the first night, on the overhang with the rain coming down, except that this time she recognized what was behind it. He was a man who had been burned by trusting the wrong person, and he was deciding very carefully whether to trust someone new. She understood that. She was doing the same thing. Thank you, he said. It came out simple and genuine, without the awkward weight some men put on gratitude when it surprised them. I'll set up the new system tomorrow, she said. You'll be able to check it yourself without needing an accountant. It'll take about 3 days to get it running. What do you want for it? He asked. Not suspiciously, practically. Clara looked at the desk, at the neat stack of ledgers she'd worked through, at the penciled totals in her own handwriting. Room and board for now, she said, for me and Lily. And I want to be useful here. Actually useful, not decorative. If that arrangement stops working for either of us, we'll say so plainly and figure out something else. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. That's a reasonable offer, he said. I know, Clara said. She thought she heard something that might have been a sound of amusement from him as he left, but she wasn't certain, and she didn't turn around to check. The new accounting system took 4 days, not 3, because on the second day she discovered that the filing cabinet's broken drawer contained a second set of receipts that Garrett had apparently forgotten about, or had intended to destroy and hadn't gotten around to, which required her to revise her total upward by another $60 and then go through the entire exercise again. During those 4 days, she also learned several things about Silver Creek Ranch that had nothing to do with accounting. She learned that Irene Paskey had been widowed 12 years ago when her husband was killed in a cattle accident on a ranch 3 counties over, and that she had worked for Wyatt since the following spring, and that her loyalty to him was of the particular iron core variety that had been earned rather than offered. She didn't talk about it directly. Irene did very little directly, but it came through in the way she ran the kitchen, the way she knew where everything was and what everyone needed before they asked for it, the way she would occasionally and without explanation put an extra biscuit on Wyatt's plate. She learned that Pete, the red-haired ranch hand who had been loudly skeptical of her from the first morning, was 23 years old and had been at Silver Creek for 2 years and had applied, unsuccessfully, for the position of foreman 3 months ago. This information came from Harlow, the quietest of the 3 hands, who offered it without being asked one afternoon while she was reviewing records at the kitchen table, and he was repairing a piece of harness near the back door. He thought he'd get promoted when the old foreman left, Harlow said, without looking up from the harness. Wyatt brought in someone from outside instead, fellow named Cole. Pete didn't take to it well. Is Cole good at his job? Clara asked. Good enough, Harlow said. Better than Pete would have been, I'd say, but that's not something Pete wants to hear. And what does Pete think about me being here? Clara asked. Harlow was quiet for a moment, working a leather lace through a buckle with patient concentration. He thinks you're after something, he said, same as most people who arrive without an invitation. What do you think? She asked. Harlow looked up at her. He had a broad, plain face and the kind of eyes that noticed more than they let on. "I think you found $380 that nobody else found," he said, "and I think that's worth something." She also learned, during those 4 days, that the trouble with Colton Voss was older and more serious than she'd initially understood. She heard the name first from Irene, mentioned in passing when a rider came to the gate on the third morning with a message that made Wyatt's face go very still before he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, and didn't mention it at breakfast. Irene said the name quietly to herself in the kitchen, the way you say a name you've said too many times and have grown tired of. "Who is Voss?" Clara asked. Irene glanced at the door, though no one was near it. "Big rancher east of here," she said. "Has about 3 times Wyatt's land. Been after Silver Creek's water rights for 2 years. "What's the argument?" "There's a creek," Irene said. "Goes through both properties. Wyatt's family put in the original water claim 30 years ago. His father's claim, legal and registered. Voss wants it. Says the paperwork is invalid. Says the original registration was improper." "Is it?" Irene made that sound again, the one that communicated a great deal in a small space. "Voss has a lawyer in Billings who says it is. Wyatt has a lawyer in Billings who says it isn't. What Voss actually has is money and patience and the belief that he can outlast anyone." "Has he tried anything beyond legal pressure?" Irene was quiet for a beat too long. "The fence on the north pasture came down last spring," she said. "In 3 places, all in the same week. Cattle wandered. 2 got lost entirely." She turned back to the stove. "Could have been weather. Wyatt filed a report with the county. Nothing came of it." Clara absorbed this. "And the message this morning?" "Voss's rider," Irene said. "Comes every few weeks. Always something polite on the outside. Always something unpleasant on the inside." Clara thought about the ledgers in the office, about Garrett's careful, patient theft, about the money that had gone missing from a ranch that was already under pressure from a neighbor with more resources and fewer scruples. She thought about timing. She thought about whether someone with an interest in weakening Silver Creek might have had a reason to keep its books in disorder. She went back to the office and sat down and stared at the numbers for a long time, turning something over in her mind that wasn't ready to be a conclusion yet. On the evening of the 4th day, she presented Wyatt with the completed system. It was not complicated. She had learned that complicated systems were rarely used correctly, and simple ones that people actually understood were worth 10 times as much. She had set up 3 parallel records: a daily transaction log that anyone could fill in, a weekly summary that she would compile, and a monthly verification against supplier receipts that Wyatt could check himself without needing to understand the full accounting behind it. She walked him through it at the desk, while Lily sat on the floor nearby, which she had discovered in the past few days was where Lily preferred to be. On a surface with things to look at and grab, preferably within sight of other people but not being actively handled. She was a sociable baby in the particular way of children who have spent their short lives in different environments and adapted to each one without fuss. Wyatt listened carefully. He asked 3 questions, all of them specific and practical, and when she answered them, he nodded and didn't ask the same question twice. She appreciated that. "This is clear," he said when she finished. "It should be," she said. "If someone tries to do what Garrett did, it'll show up within a week." "You thought of everything," he said. "I thought of most things," she said. "Something will come up that I didn't think of. That's how it works." He looked at her sideways, in the way she'd noticed he sometimes did when she said something he hadn't expected. She was never quite sure what she said that surprised him. The honesty, maybe. She'd found that men often said they wanted honesty and then were mildly startled when they got it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes. Why did you come on the train?" He said it carefully, as if he'd been thinking about how to phrase it. "After you got the message that he wasn't coming. You knew he wasn't coming. Why come anyway?" Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at Lily, who was examining a wooden button she'd found on the floor, with the intense scientific focus of someone conducting important research. "Because I had nothing to go back to," she said. "I'd given up my room and sold the furniture and told everyone I was leaving. Going back meant admitting 2 large failures at once, and I couldn't do that. So I made a different kind of failure instead, and got on the train." "Coming out here wasn't a failure," Wyatt said. "It wasn't a success yet either," she said. "I'll let you know when I've decided what it is." He almost smiled. She was reasonably sure of it. It was the kind of expression that moved through his face quickly and left before it could be confirmed. What changed everything about Pete happened at the end of the first week, and it happened the way most things at Silver Creek seemed to happen, without warning and at an inconvenient time. Clara was at the well in the backyard filling a bucket when she heard Pete and another hand named Sam talking on the other side of the barn wall. She wasn't intending to overhear. She was simply there, and they didn't know it, and their voices carried. "Can't figure out what Mercer's thinking," Pete was saying. "Bringing in some woman who washed up at the train station. We don't know anything about her." "She seems capable enough," Sam said. He sounded like a man trying to be fair despite not being entirely committed to the project. Capable. Pete's voice had the particular sneer of someone who considers capability beside the point. "She showed up in a wedding dress with somebody else's baby and no husband. What does that tell you?" "Her own baby," Sam said. "You know what I mean." Clara set down the bucket very carefully and stood still. She had the choice of walking away or waiting. She waited because she wanted to hear how far this was going to go. "Garrett said she'd be trouble," Pete said. Clara went very still. Sam's voice. "You talked to Garrett?" A pause, long enough to be meaningful. "Ran into him in town before he left. He said if any woman came looking to run the books, she'd find things that didn't add up. Said it wasn't his fault, that Wyatt had told him to run things a certain way." "Wyatt told him to—" "That's what he said." Clara picked up the bucket and walked back to the house. Her hands were steady. Her face was neutral. She had learned a long time ago that the moment you let someone see what they've landed on, you give them power they haven't earned. She found Wyatt mending a fence post near the south field. She waited until she was close enough to speak quietly. "Pete was in contact with Garrett before Garrett left," she said. Wyatt stopped what he was doing. She told him what she'd heard, word for word. She had a good memory for conversation. It had served her well in the accounting work she'd done in Boston, where clients sometimes said things verbally that contradicted what they signed, and she repeated it accurately without editorializing. When she finished, Wyatt drove the fence post into the ground with one deliberate strike of the mallet. "Garrett told Pete I'd told him to run things a certain way," he said. "Yes. I never told Garrett any such thing." "I know," she said. He stood there for a moment. The wind was moving through the grass and the sky was the heavy white of approaching weather. "Garrett was protecting himself," Wyatt said. "Giving Pete a story in case anyone started asking questions." "Yes. And if Pete believed it, or wanted to believe it, then he'd have a reason to discredit anyone who came looking at the books. Discredit you specifically." "I'm the person who found the discrepancies," Clara said. "If Pete questions my credibility, questions my motives for being here, questions what I found, then maybe Garrett's story holds up a little longer." Wyatt looked at the fence post. He looked at the south field. He looked at something past the tree line that she couldn't see. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Nothing yet," she said. "I want to know if Pete knew about the theft or only knows what Garrett told him afterward. Those are different problems." "How do you tell the difference?" "Carefully," she said, "and without letting Pete know I'm trying." It was Harlow who gave her the next piece, and he did it entirely by accident. She had been at Silver Creek for 12 days when she found him at the barn early one morning, doing something with the saddle that needed a third hand, and she held the piece he needed while he worked the lace through. They had developed an easy, quiet working relationship. Harlow was the kind of man who respected competence without making a production of it, and Clara appreciated his company for the same reason she appreciated Wyatt's. He didn't fill space unnecessarily. "Pete went to town last night," Harlow said, not looking at her, working the lace. "Didn't come back until past midnight." "Does he do that often?" Clara asked. "Not often. Couple times since you arrived." He paused. "Goes to the Criterion mostly. Sometimes sees a man named Calloway." Clara kept her face neutral. "Who is Calloway?" Harlow was quiet long enough that she knew he was deciding something. "Calloway runs errands for Voss," he said. "Not official. Nothing you could write down." She held the piece steady and didn't say anything, and Harlow worked the lace through to the end and tied it off and stood back to check the result. "I could be wrong," he said. "A man can have a drink with someone without it meaning anything." "Yes," Clara agreed. She went back inside and sat with what she had for the rest of the morning. Garrett's patient accounting theft, over 14 months. the feed orders that came up short, the fence that came down in 3 places in 1 week, the polite messages from Voss that were never polite on the inside. Pete, who had wanted a promotion and hadn't gotten one. Pete, who had talked to Garrett. Pete, who was having drinks with a man who ran errands for the neighbor who was trying to take Wyatt's water rights. None of it was proof of anything. All of it was the shape of something she'd seen before in business, in Boston, in the small, specific world of merchants and suppliers and men who thought that taking what they wanted slowly enough would look like something else. She needed to think, and she needed more time, which she might not have. The writer came from Voss's ranch on a Tuesday morning, and this time he didn't leave a message at the gate. He rode all the way to the house and asked for Wyatt by name and delivered a letter that made Wyatt's jaw set in a way Clara hadn't seen before. He didn't tell her what was in the letter. She didn't ask. But she watched his face across the dinner table that night, the controlled stillness of a man managing something. And after Irene had gone to bed and the hands were in the bunkhouse, she went to the sitting room where he was staring at nothing with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. "Is it the water rights?" she asked. He looked up. Some of the control went out of his expression just briefly, the way it did when he forgot to maintain it. "He's filed a new challenge," he said, "in Billings. Claims he has documentation showing the original registration was transferred improperly when my father died." "Does such documentation exist?" "Not that I know of," Wyatt said. "My father's estate was handled by a lawyer in Helena. Everything was filed correctly." "Where are those filings?" Clara asked. "In a box in the study." "Have you looked at them recently?" He was quiet, which meant no. "Can I?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "You've already been doing more than I asked," he said. "You didn't ask me to find Garrett's theft either," she said. "I found it because it was there and I was looking." He set down the untouched glass and stood up. "I'll get the box," he said. The box turned out to be 2 boxes, both dusty, both containing the accumulated legal and financial documents of a ranch that had changed hands once and weathered several decades of frontier record-keeping. Wyatt brought them to the dining table and they sat across from each other and went through them, Wyatt knowing the history and Clara knowing what she was looking for, which was a useful division of knowledge. It took until past midnight. What they found was this. The original water rights registration was properly filed. Wyatt's father's estate transfer was properly documented. The chain of ownership was clean and complete and held together the way things hold together when someone did them right the first time. What they also found, tucked at the bottom of the second box beneath a stack of old supply contracts, was a document Clara almost missed because it was folded inside another document and used the same formal legal language as everything around it. It was a transfer agreement, dated 4 years ago, transferring a 1/3 interest in Silver Creek's water rights to a holding company called Cascade Land Associates. Wyatt's signature was at the bottom. Wyatt looked at it for a long time. "I didn't sign this," he said. His voice was very flat. Clara looked at the signature. Then she took out of the box an older document she'd set aside, a property agreement from 8 years prior, with Wyatt's actual signature on it. She set the 2 documents side by side. The signatures were similar. They were not the same. "Someone forged this," she said. Wyatt's hand on the table was completely still, but the stillness had changed quality. "Cascade Land Associates," he said. "I've never heard of them." "I have," Clara said. He looked at her. "In the ledger," she said. "Third entry, January. Service payment to Cascade Land Associates, $48 consultancy fees." She paused. "It was one of Garrett's fabrications. One of the ones I couldn't trace to any actual supplier." The room was very quiet. "Garrett set up the company," Wyatt said. "Not a question. He was working it through aloud." "Or someone used Garrett to create the paper trail," Clara said. "A fabricated service payment establishes that the company exists and has a working relationship with Silver Creek. If you ever look too closely at this document," she touched the transfer agreement, "you'd find something in your own records that seemed to confirm you dealt with them." Wyatt stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she gave him a moment because it was the right thing to do. She thought about what this meant. A forged transfer of water rights, buried in the bottom of an estate box where it might never be found. A fake company established through fabricated ledger entries. A ranch hand making regular visits to a man who worked for Voss. It was not a simple theft, it was a construction. Someone had been building this for a long time, piece by piece, patient as a man who understood that the best traps were the ones the target walked into gradually. He was going to use this in the Billings challenge, Clara said. He doesn't need to win in court. He just needs to create enough confusion about the ownership that you can't demonstrate clean title. Cloud the water rights. Make Silver Creek look like it's in a dispute with its own history. Wyatt turned around. His face had settled into something that was not anger exactly. Deeper than anger. The expression of a man who has understood the full scope of what's been done to him and is deciding what to do about it. "What do I do?" he asked. "You don't ride over to Voss's ranch and do what I suspect you want to do," Clara said. "Because that's what he's expecting, and it won't help you." "What do I do instead?" "You let me make copies of everything, the real documents and this one. You take it to your lawyer in Helena, not Billings, because I don't know who in Billings might be connected to this. And you let me figure out where Cascade Land Associates is actually registered, because it was created somewhere and there will be a record." "You can do that?" "I know how to look," she said. "I may need to send some letters. It'll take time." "Voss filed the challenge 3 weeks ago," Wyatt said. "The hearing is in 6 weeks." "Then I'll work quickly," Clara said. She said it with more confidence than she fully felt. She did know how to look. She had traced disputed accounts and followed paper trails through the Boston merchant records for men who thought they'd hidden things that couldn't be found. But this was bigger than a merchant dispute, and the people involved had more resources than anyone she'd dealt with before, and she was doing it in a place where she had no established relationships and no reputation to open doors. But she had Wyatt's trust. That was something. And she had the documents. That was more. She started making copies by lamplight while Wyatt went to lock the originals in the iron strongbox. He kept bolted to the wall in the study, and Lily slept in the crate in the corner of the dining room, and the ranch was quiet around them, with the particular deep quiet of a place at the edge of something that hadn't broken yet. Clara wrote in her careful, precise hand, the hand that had balanced books for merchants in Boston, organized the disordered accounts of Silver Creek, and found the ghost of Garrett's theft hiding in plain sight. And she did not let herself think about whether this was too much, or whether she was out of her depth, or whether she had made a terrible mistake coming here. She thought about the numbers, about what they told her and what they didn't, about where the next thread was and how to follow it. She had arrived in Montana with nothing and no plan. She was beginning to understand that what she'd arrived with was more than she'd given herself credit for, and that what was happening at Silver Creek Ranch was exactly the kind of problem that required the precise, patient, unspectacular kind of intelligence that other people consistently underestimated in her. Whether that would be enough, she still didn't know. She kept writing. The letters went out the next morning. Clara wrote 4 of them before breakfast, sitting at the dining table with Lily propped against her hip and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She wrote to the Territorial Records Office in Helena asking for any registered business under the name Cascade Land Associates. She wrote to the county clerk's office in Billings asking for the filing history on the water rights challenge, specifically who had submitted it and which attorney of record was listed. She wrote to a former colleague in Boston, a man named Aldrich who worked in commercial law and owed her a professional courtesy for work she'd done on a disputed account 3 years prior, asking what he knew about the mechanics of fraudulent land transfer documents and what made them detectable. And she wrote a 4th letter, the most careful of all, to the lawyer in Helena who had handled Wyatt's father's estate, asking for a certified copy of the original transfer documents and inquiring, in language that was polite and indirect, whether anyone else had requested access to those records in the past 2 years. She sealed them and gave them to Wyatt before he rode out, and he took them to town himself rather than sending Pete, which told her he had absorbed last night's information about Pete and Calloway without needing to discuss it further. She respected that. What she could not afford to respect was time. 6 weeks sounded like enough until you counted the days the mail would take each direction, the time a records office might sit on a request, the possibility that the Helena lawyer had retired or moved or simply would not respond quickly to an inquiry from a stranger. 6 weeks was not enough. It was what she had. She went back to the office and started mapping what she knew. She used a blank supply ledger. The back pages were empty and the paper was good. And she drew it out the way she used to draw out disputed accounts in Boston, a kind of physical diagram that let her see relationships she couldn't hold in her head simultaneously. Voss at the top, with lines going down to Garrett, to Cascade Land Associates, to the lawyer in Billings whose name was on the water rights challenge, a man called Hessing, whom she'd pulled from the court filing Wyatt had received. Lines from Garrett to Pete. A dotted line from Pete to Calloway. A dotted line from Calloway back up to Voss. She looked at it. Then she drew a line from Cascade Land Associates back to Silver Creek's own ledger, the fabricated service entry, the $48 that had bought the company its false existence in the ranch's paper history. What she had was a picture of how Voss had intended this to work. Not violence, not an open fight over the water. A paper siege. Years of patient document manipulation designed to arrive at a single moment in a Billings courtroom where a judge would look at a forged transfer agreement and a fabricated paper trail and a ranch that had been quietly bled of money and credibility and would conclude that the water rights were genuinely in dispute, at which point Voss would offer to buy Silver Creek, probably for less than it was worth. And Wyatt, who was already under financial pressure that Garrett had helped create, would be looking at a legal battle he couldn't afford against a man with unlimited resources. She stared at the diagram. The thing that struck her was how long this had been running. Garrett had been at Silver Creek for at least 14 months before he left, and the fabricated entries began almost immediately, which meant Garrett had been placed there or recruited very early, which meant Voss had started building this, probably, 2 years ago, around the same time the legal pressure about the water rights had begun. She thought about the fence that had come down in the north pasture, the 2 lost cattle, the small accumulation of inconveniences that were individually explainable and collectively were the slow draining of a man's resources and patience. She thought about how long you had to hate someone, or want what they had, to plan this carefully for this many years. Then she picked up her pen and started writing a summary of what she knew and what she still needed, because thinking about Voss's patience was not useful, and finding his mistakes was. Pete confronted her 4 days later. She had been expecting something. She'd been watching him watching her since the conversation at the barn wall, and she'd seen the shift in him, the way a man's behavior changes when he's deciding what to do about a problem he didn't anticipate. He'd been less overtly hostile at meals. He'd been quieter in general. She'd learned to distrust quiet in men who had previously been loud. It happened in the late afternoon when she was walking back from the south field, where she'd gone to take measurements Wyatt had asked for in connection with a fencing repair. She was carrying a notebook, and Lily was back at the house with Irene. She was alone. Pete stepped out from the side of the barn. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't block her path. He just appeared there and said her name. "Miss Whitmore." She stopped. "Pete." He looked uncomfortable, which was interesting. She'd expected hostile. Uncomfortable meant he was doing something that cost him something, which meant he hadn't been entirely comfortable with it to begin with. "I've been thinking," he said. "About Garrett." She waited. "What he told me," Pete said, "about Wyatt telling him to run the books a certain way. I believed him at the time. He was convincing." He stopped, looked at the ground, looked back up. "But I've been thinking about the timing of it. He said it right before he left. And the way he said it, it was like he wanted me to, like he needed me to have a reason not to ask questions if anyone started asking." Clara looked at him steadily. "Did you tell anyone what Garrett said?" Pete's jaw tightened. "I mentioned it to Calloway." "When?" "Week and a half ago, the first time I saw him after you arrived." She absorbed this. "What did Calloway say?" "He said it was useful to know." Pete's voice had an edge now. Not at her, she thought, but at himself. Or at Calloway. "Said he might need to pass it along." "To Voss," Clara said. Pete didn't answer, which was an answer. "Did you understand what Calloway was going to do with it?" she asked. She was keeping her voice level, the tone she used when she needed someone to keep talking rather than defending themselves. She'd used it in Boston with men who owed money and were trying to explain their way around it. "I thought—" Pete stopped. "I thought it was just talk. Calloway likes to collect information. I didn't think it would—" He stopped again. "Was Garrett stealing from Wyatt?" "Yes," Clara said. Pete was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon light was going orange and long across the field behind her, and somewhere a hawk was making its slow circles. She watched him work through it, not the calculation of someone trying to figure out what to admit, but the genuine, slow realization of someone who had been used and was only now seeing the shape of it. Was I helping him? Pete asked. His voice was different now, younger, somehow. You told Calloway something Garrett had told you, Clara said. That's not the same as knowing what it was for. But if Calloway used it, then Calloway made that choice, she said, not you. Pete looked at her like he was trying to decide whether she meant it or was just being strategic. She was being both, which was its own kind of honesty. What do I do? He asked. She thought about what she needed and what would actually help Wyatt. Stop seeing Calloway, she said. Don't explain why, just stop going, and if Calloway reaches out to you, tell me. That's all? That's enough, she said. For now. He nodded once. He looked like he wanted to say something else and couldn't find it. She didn't help him. She'd done enough. And walked past him toward the house. She wasn't sure she trusted him, but she trusted his discomfort, which was something she'd learned to use over the years. A man who felt genuinely ashamed of something was a man who didn't want to do more of it. The first letter back arrived 12 days after she'd sent them, which was faster than she'd expected and carried the slight shock of good news arriving before you'd steeled yourself against its absence. It was from the Territorial Records Office in Helena. Cascade Land Associates had been registered 18 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm, a different billings firm from the one handling the water rights challenge, which was Careful, but the registration listed two principals. One name she didn't recognize. The other was a man named Leonard Garrett. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went to find Wyatt. He was in the barn. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it again. Garrett's named on the company, he said. Which means Voss needed Garrett specifically, Clara said. Not just someone who could manipulate books. Someone who could be listed as a principal in the holding company that was going to own the transferred water rights. Someone who could sign documents as a company officer if necessary. And Garrett was willing to do that. Garrett was well compensated, Clara said. The $400 he took from your books was probably the smallest part of his payment. Wyatt's expression did something complicated. He set down the letter. He picked up a piece of harness he'd been working on before she arrived and turned it in his hands without looking at it. He sat at my table, Wyatt said, for 14 months. Ate Irene's cooking. I paid him fair wages. Yes, Clara said. She didn't add anything to that. There was nothing useful to add. What does this give us? It gives us a documented connection between Garrett and the company that appears on the forged transfer, she said. That's the thread. If we can show that Garrett was a Voss instrument, that he was placed here rather than hired honestly, then the forged document stops being an unfortunate mystery and becomes part of a deliberate scheme. How do we show that? We need to show how Garrett came to be hired, Clara said. Who recommended him? Whether the recommendation came from anyone connected to Voss. Wyatt was very still. Colton Voss recommended him, he said. Clara looked at him. 2 years ago, Wyatt said. I was looking for a bookkeeper. Voss mentioned at a county meeting that he knew a fellow who was good with numbers, looking for a position. I thought... He stopped. The expression on his face was one she hadn't seen on him before. A brief open nakedness, the look of a man seeing his own credulity from the outside. I thought he was being neighborly. He was being very careful, Clara said. He put Garrett here himself, Wyatt said. And then Garrett did exactly what he'd been sent to do, she said. And when the time was right, he left, clean, with a story for Pete to spread around in case anyone started looking. She paused. Voss has been doing this for 2 years, Wyatt. Probably longer. This isn't something he put together quickly. Wyatt put down the harness. He looked at the barn wall with the expression of a man deciding something. I want to go talk to him, he said. Not asking, stating. I know, Clara said. Tell me why I shouldn't. Because you'll go there angry, she said, and he'll be calm. Because he's been planning this for 2 years and knows exactly what he wants to say to you. And because the moment you go there angry, you've shown him that you know what he's been doing, and he'll move the rest of the plan faster before you can stop it. Wyatt was quiet. 6 weeks is still 4 weeks away, Clara said. I need those 4 weeks. Every day you give me is another letter answered, another piece of documentation we have that he doesn't know we have. He looked at her. You're asking me to do nothing. I'm asking you to do the harder thing, she said, which is to let me work. He turned and walked out of the barn. He didn't slam anything, didn't raise his voice. He just needed to walk. And she let him. She understood that too. The particular helplessness of a man whose instinct was to act and who was being asked to be patient. She'd spent most of her adult life being asked to be patient, to wait for the right time, the right circumstances, the right moment when her careful work would finally be allowed to matter. She had not always managed it with grace. The second letter arrived 3 days later. It was from Aldrich in Boston. He wrote with the dry precision she remembered, 4 pages of close handwriting on legal stationery, covering the mechanics of fraudulent land transfer documents, how they were typically constructed, what made them detectable, and 3 specific cases from the northeastern states where such documents had been successfully challenged in court. What Aldrich wrote, buried in the 3rd page, was the piece she needed. The most successful challenges to forged land documents, he wrote, relied not on proving the document itself was a forgery, which required handwriting expertise and the cooperation of courts that often resisted overturning their own prior records, but on establishing that the underlying transaction was impossible. If you could demonstrate that the parties to the transaction had no legitimate relationship, no prior dealing, no logical reason to enter into the agreement shown, and that the only evidence of any relationship was itself fabricated, then the document lost its plausibility regardless of whether a handwriting expert could prove the signature was false. Clara read that sentence 3 times. Cascade Land Associates had been registered 18 months ago. The forged transfer agreement was dated 4 years ago, more than 2 years before the company existed. She sat at the desk and looked at what she'd just understood. The document purporting to transfer water rights to Cascade Land Associates was dated 4 years ago. The company itself had not existed 4 years ago. It had been registered 18 months ago by Garrett, by order of whoever had constructed this plan. The transfer agreement was not just a forgery, it was an impossible document. It transferred rights to a company that could not have received them on the date shown because that company did not yet exist. She went to find Wyatt. He was in the south field. She walked the half-mile without stopping, her boots getting wet in the grass. When she reached him, she was breathing harder than she'd meant to and held out the letter. "Read the part I underlined," she said. He read it. He looked at her. She watched him find the same thing she'd found. "The company didn't exist 4 years ago," he said. "No, it was registered 18 months ago. The transfer agreement is dated 4 years ago." "Yes." He looked at the letter, he looked at the field, he looked at her. "That's it," he said. It came out quieter than she expected. "That's the whole thing." "It's the central flaw," she said. "But we need to document it properly. We need the Helena registration date certified. We need a legal opinion on what it means for the validity of the transfer. And we need a lawyer in Helena who can present this to the court before the Billings hearing." "My lawyer there." "Yes," she said. "We need to send him everything and get him working on this immediately. Today." Wyatt was already moving toward the horse tied at the fence. "I'll go to town and send a wire," he said, faster than a letter. "Send the wire," she said, "but also send copies of the registration record, the transfer document, and Aldrich's letter by mail today. Don't send them together. Use different envelopes, different addresses at the lawyer's office. I want there to be multiple copies reaching him." Wyatt looked at her over the horse's back. "Why different addresses?" "Because I don't know who's watching the mail in Billings," she said, "and I don't want one intercepted package to be the end of this." He didn't question her logic. He was learning, she thought, not to question her instincts about information and paper. He got on the horse. "Clara," he said. She looked up. You're... He stopped, started again. "You're very good at this." It was not, she thought, the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, but it was possibly the most valuable thing, because it was delivered as a plain fact by a man who did not say things he didn't mean. "I know," she said. "Go send the wire." He went. The trouble came from a direction she hadn't been watching closely enough, which was her own fault, and she knew it the moment it happened. She had been focused on the documents, on the letters, on the legal architecture of what Voss had built, and how to dismantle it. She had not been paying enough attention to the physical ranch, to what was happening outside the office window while she worked inside it. The cattle went missing on a Wednesday night. 23 head from the north pasture, the fence cut in 2 places. Not the 3-place collapse of last spring that could be attributed to weather, but a deliberate two-cut job that pushed the herd through a specific gap toward the creek border. Harlow found it at first light and came to the house before the rest of the hands were up. Wyatt's face when Harlow told him was the face she'd seen once before, in the barn, when she'd told him about Garrett's total, that controlled stillness that preceded something more dangerous. He got dressed and went out, and she heard horses leaving at a pace that suggested urgency. She got Lily up and fed and dressed and went to the kitchen, where Irene was standing at the window with her coffee. "How bad?" Clara asked. 23 head, Irene said. "Some might come back on their own, some won't." "The fence was cut," Clara said. "Harlow said so." "This is Voss," Clara said, "or someone working for him." "It always is," Irene said. There was a weariness in her voice that was not resignation, more like the exhaustion of someone who had been watching a wrong thing happen for a long time and had not stopped believing it was wrong. Clara sat down at the kitchen table. She had letters coming. She had a lawyer in Helena who had now received Wyatt's wire and would be working on the registration date issue. She had documentation that was building toward something solid. But all of that was weeks away, and right now 23 cattle were gone, and Wyatt was riding out toward the creek border with his jaw set in a way that frightened her. "Irene," she said, "is there anyone in town, anyone on the county commission or the sheriff's office, who Wyatt actually trusts?" Irene thought about it. "Sheriff Blaine is an honest man," she said slowly. "Not brave, but honest. He doesn't take money from Voss, best I know. He doesn't like confrontation." "What about the county commissioner?" "Ferris is in Voss's pocket," Irene said flatly. "Has been for years." "Is there anyone else? Anyone with legal standing who isn't connected to Voss?" Irene looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Wyatt is going to reach the creek border and see Voss's men on the other side with his cattle," Clara said. "And I'm thinking what happens after that depends entirely on whether there's a third party present." Irene was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Judge Carver in Billings. He's not part of any of this. He's done legitimate work for half the ranches in the county, including this one, years ago. He's old now and doesn't take much work, but he's trusted." "Does Wyatt know him?" "His father did," Irene said. "Wyatt's met him." Clara stood up. "Can you write to him? From you, not from Wyatt. I don't want this to look like a legal maneuver. I want it to look like what it is, which is someone asking a respected man to be aware of a situation that might come to a head." Irene looked at her with the expression she'd used on Clara's first morning, assessing, measuring. "You're very young to think the way you think," she said. "I've had to," Clara said. Irene picked up her coffee. "I'll write to Carver today," she said. "What?" "Wyatt came back at midday with 11 of the 23 cattle. He'd found them at the creek, as Clara had expected. Voss's hands had been on the other side. 3 of them," Wyatt said, standing well back from the property line, doing nothing actionable, just watching. 2 of the missing cattle had wandered deeper into the territory between properties and would need to be tracked. 10 were gone, probably moved off in the night. He told her this in the kitchen, standing at the sink with his coat still on, drinking water like a man who had been riding harder than he'd intended. "You didn't do anything," she said. It wasn't a question. He was standing in her kitchen rather than in a Billings jail. "I wanted to," he said. "I know." 3 of his men, Wyatt said, standing there with their arms crossed, looking at me like they were waiting for something. "They were waiting for something," Clara said. "They were hoping you'd cross the line." He set down the cup. "How long does this go on?" "Until the hearing," she said. "After the hearing, it stops, one way or another." He turned and looked at her directly. "What happens at the hearing if we're not ready?" "We'll be ready," she said. "That's not an answer." "No," she said. "It's not, but it's what I've got." He held her gaze for a moment, not challenging her, looking for something. She wasn't sure what he found. "The cattle," he said. "The 10 that are gone. That's money I don't have to spare." "I know." "Voss knows that too," Wyatt said. "He knows how to add pressure without crossing a line that would get him in trouble. He's been doing it for 2 years. He's also been assuming that you'd face this alone," Clara said. "That you'd have no documentation, no legal argument, nothing but an angry rancher who can't prove anything." Wyatt was quiet. "He doesn't know what we found," she said. "He doesn't know about Aldrich's letter or the Helena registration date. He doesn't know what we sent to Helena or why. He's still running his plan, and his plan assumed you'd have nothing. Do we have enough? She considered being reassuring. She decided against it. Not yet, she said. We have enough to build from. We need the certified registration date from Helena, and we need the lawyer there to confirm the legal argument holds. When that arrives, we have enough. When does it arrive? 2, maybe 3 weeks, she said. That's 3 weeks of Voss doing what he did last night, Wyatt said. Yes, she said, but at the end of those 3 weeks, we have something that ends this. Not slows it down, ends it. He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen had the afternoon sounds of a working ranch around it. Irene in the garden, the distant work of the hands, a horse being walked past the window. All right, Wyatt said. He said it with the deliberateness of someone making a decision they're going to commit to. 3 weeks. Maybe 2, she said. I'll follow up on the wire. He nodded. He started to go, then stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. You should know, he said, that when this is over, I'm going to have to figure out what to do about you. She blinked. What does that mean? Now he turned, and his expression was the closest thing to unguarded she'd seen on him. You came here for a temporary arrangement, he said. Room and board until you figured out your next move. That's what you said. Yes. I don't think that's what this is anymore, he said. And I think you probably know that. I'm just saying it plainly so you don't think I haven't noticed. He left before she could answer. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to his boots on the porch, and then looked down at her hands on the table. The hands that had been writing letters and copying documents and tracing the shape of a conspiracy through other people's records, and felt something shift in her chest that was not about Voss or the water rights or the forged transfer agreement at all. She picked up her pen. She had 3 weeks, maybe 2. She had documents to organize, letters to follow up on, and a legal argument to help build for a lawyer she'd never met in a city she'd only passed through on a train. The feeling in her chest could wait. She had work to do. The certified document from Helena arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after Wyatt had sent the wire. Clara was in the office when Wyatt brought it in from town, still in his coat, and she knew from the way he set it on the desk, carefully, like something that might break or might not be real, that it was what they'd been waiting for. She opened it, read it again. The Territorial Records Office confirmed, in certified language with an official seal, that Cascade Land Associates had been registered in the territory on March 14th of the previous year, 18 months ago. The document was signed, notarized, and carried the weight of an official record. The forged transfer agreement was dated 4 years prior. She set both documents side by side on the desk. The certified registration, the impossible transfer. She had been living with these numbers for weeks, but seeing them together now, the clean, official certainty of the Helena seal against the careful, fraudulent penmanship of the forged date, produced a feeling she hadn't expected. Not triumph, something quieter and more tired than triumph. That's the whole case, Wyatt said. He was standing at her shoulder, looking at the same 2 documents. It's the foundation of it, she said. Your lawyer in Helena, has he responded to the wire? Letter came yesterday, Wyatt said. He pulled it from his coat pocket. She'd noticed he'd taken to keeping correspondence in his coat pocket rather than his desk, which she thought was probably an unconscious decision to keep important things close. He says the registration date is the critical issue. If we can certify it and present it alongside the transfer agreement, he believes the court will have no choice but to reject the document as fraudulent. He wants to file a counter motion in Helena before the Billings hearing, which would move jurisdiction. Move jurisdiction, Clara said. Away from Billings. Away from Hessing, Wyatt said. Voss's lawyer there. And away from Commissioner Ferris, she said. Wyatt nodded once. She looked at the lawyer's letter. It was competent and careful, and said most of the right things, but there was a line in the 3rd paragraph that she read twice and then set down. He says the counter motion will be stronger if we can demonstrate Voss's direct connection to Garrett, she said. The registration shows Garrett's involvement in the company, but we need Voss's fingerprints on it. How? Voss recommended Garrett for this position, Clara said. You told me that. He mentioned it at a county meeting. I remember it, Wyatt said. Were other people present? 6 ranchers, Wyatt said. The quarterly meeting, end of season. Would any of them remember it? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Dan Fowler would, he said. He was standing right there, made a comment about it afterward, anything that didn't benefit himself. Would Dan Fowler sign an affidavit? Clara asked. If I asked him, Wyatt said slowly. He's had his own problems with Voss. Boundary dispute 3 years back. Never went to court, but it left a mark. Then we need to go see Dan Fowler, Clara said. Wyatt looked at her. We, he said. She met his gaze. I need to be there when you explain what we have, she said. You'll tell it accurately, but you'll tell it the way a man tells a story, starting from the front and going to the end. I need to tell it the way an accountant tells it, which is starting from the evidence and working out to the conclusion. Fowler needs to understand what he'd be signing. Wyatt considered this. She'd noticed he always actually considered things she said rather than agreeing quickly out of politeness or dismissing quickly out of pride. It was one of the qualities she'd come to rely on without quite naming it as such. All right, he said. Tomorrow morning, if the weather holds. It held. They rode out before 8, with Lily left in Irene's care and a copy of the relevant documents in the saddlebag. The Fowler Ranch was 7 miles northeast, smaller than Silver Creek, but well kept in the particular way of a man who cared more about doing things right than about how they looked from the road. Dan Fowler was a wide man in his 60s with white hair and the permanent squint of someone who had spent 40 years looking at distances. He met them at the gate with the wariness of a man who'd learned not to assume that visitors meant good news. He looked at Clara with the question all men looked at her with, which was the silent version of who is this and why is she here? Wyatt said, This is Clara Whitmore. She manages my books, and she found something I need you to hear. Fowler looked at Wyatt. He looked at Clara. Come inside, he said. They sat at his kitchen table, which was scarred and honest, and Clara laid out the documents in the order that told the story most clearly. She didn't start with Voss. She started with the numbers, with Garrett's ledger manipulations, because a man who owned a ranch understood the ledger better than he understood the law, and she wanted him in the story before she asked him to be part of it. Fowler listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Some men couldn't do that. They felt the need to demonstrate comprehension by speaking into the gaps, which usually meant they understood less by the end than if they'd stayed quiet. When she reached the registration date, the certified Helena document against the 4-year-old forged transfer, Fowler leaned forward and read both dates himself, slowly, his lips moving slightly. The company didn't exist, he said. Not for another 2.5 years after the date on that document, Clara said. Fowler sat back. He looked at Wyatt. He put Garrett here himself, he said. 2 years ago, Wyatt said, county quarterly meeting. You were standing there. Fowler was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the table in the way men looked at things when they were seeing something other than what was in front of them. I remember it, he said. I remember thinking it was unlike Voss to do someone a favor for nothing. It wasn't for nothing, Wyatt said. No. Fowler looked at the documents again. What do you need from me? An affidavit, Clara said, stating that you were present when Voss recommended Garrett for the bookkeeping position at Silver Creek, the date and location, what was said, and who else was present. We need it notarized and delivered to Wyatt's lawyer in Helena within the week. The week, Fowler said. The Billings hearing is in 3 weeks, Clara said. The countermotion in Helena needs to be filed before that. Your affidavit is part of what establishes Voss's direct involvement in placing Garrett here. Fowler looked at her with the measuring expression of a man deciding something serious. You're thorough, he said. It wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite not one. I try to be, Clara said. If I do this, Fowler said, and Voss finds out, which he will, I'll have my own problems. Yes, Clara said. She didn't soften it. I won't tell you otherwise. Fowler looked at Wyatt. She always this direct? Always, Wyatt said. Fowler was quiet for another moment. Then he stood up and went to the cabinet where he kept his writing things, and came back with paper and a pen and sat down. Tell me what it needs to say, he said. The ride back to Silver Creek took longer than the ride out because the sky had gone the flat white of incoming weather, and Wyatt chose a lower route that offered some shelter from the wind. They rode mostly in silence, which was the comfortable kind they'd developed over weeks of working alongside each other, and Clara held the saddlebag with the documents against her side, and thought about what was still missing. They had the certified registration date. They had Garrett's documented connection to the forged company. They had Wyatt's testimony about the recommendation. They would have Fowler's affidavit. They had Aldrich's legal opinion. They had the original estate documents proving clean title. What they did not have was Voss's signature on anything. They had circumstantial connections, a recommendation here, a fabricated entry there, but nothing that put Voss's name directly on the fraud. She had been turning this over for days, setting it aside and coming back to it, because the absence of it was the one gap in everything they'd built, and she knew Hessing, Voss's Billings lawyer, would find it and put his whole argument through that gap if he could. She was still thinking about it when they came over the rise and saw the man waiting at Silver Creek's front gate. He was on foot, which was unusual. His horse was tied to the post, and he was standing beside it with the particular patience of someone who had been there for a while and expected to be there longer. He was perhaps 40. In a dark coat and a hat he wore straight rather than pushed back, and as they rode closer, Clara saw that he had the bearing of someone accustomed to waiting in front of buildings and delivering things people didn't want. Wyatt pulled up. "Can I help you?" The man looked at both of them. His gaze moved to Clara and held there for a moment before returning to Wyatt. "Message for a Miss Whitmore," he said, "from Mr. Colton Voss." Clara felt the back of her neck go still the way it did when something unexpected required immediate, careful thinking. She kept her face neutral. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said. He reached into his coat and handed her a folded envelope. He did it like a man who was performing a function and had no personal investment in its outcome, which probably meant he didn't know what was inside. She took it. She didn't open it immediately because she didn't want to read it in front of a man she didn't know. "Is there a reply expected?" she asked. "Mr. Voss said he'd appreciate one by end of week," the man said. Then he untied his horse, mounted, and rode east. Wyatt watched him go. Then he looked at Clara. She could see him working to keep his face in the same controlled stillness he'd been using all month. "He knows your name," Wyatt said. "Yes," she said. She opened the envelope. The letter was short, half a page, in a precise, educated hand that communicated, probably intentionally, that the writer was someone accustomed to correspondence and not troubled by it. It addressed her by name, without the miss, a small discourtesy that was either careless or deliberate. She assumed deliberate. It said, "I am aware of the work you have been doing on behalf of Mr. Mercer, and I believe there may be a productive conversation to be had between us before matters progress further. I am a reasonable man, and reasonable arrangements can generally be found. I would suggest we meet at the Criterion Hotel in Billings, at your earliest convenience, at which time I can outline what I have in mind. I trust you understand that certain current circumstances could be resolved to everyone's benefit with appropriate discussion." She read it twice. Then she handed it to Wyatt. He read it without expression. When he finished, his jaw was set in the way it got when he was managing something that wanted to come out differently. "He's trying to buy you," Wyatt said. "He's trying to find out what I know," Clara said. "If I go, he'll try to assess what we have. If I don't go, he'll know we're further along than he hoped." She paused. "He knows enough to be nervous. That's what this is." "How does he know about you at all?" "Pete told Calloway about me," she said. "Calloway told Voss. I'm the person who found Garrett's theft. Pete knew that much because everyone on the ranch knew it." She looked at the letter again. "He doesn't know what else I've found. He's guessing." "You're not going to meet with him," Wyatt said. "No," she said. "But I'm going to write back." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because what I write back will tell him what I want him to think we have," she said. "And what I want him to think we have is exactly enough to make him worried, but not so much that he does something drastic." She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. "He's been in control of this for 2 years. He hasn't had to react to someone else's move yet. I want him reacting." They rode through the gate. Wyatt was quiet until they reached the barn. "Clara," he said as they dismounted. "Yes." "Be careful with this." He said it simply, without the layered warning some men would have put in it, the implication that she was in over her head or that she needed protecting. Just a plain statement of genuine concern. "I will," she said, and she meant it. She wrote the reply that evening after Lily was down and the house was quiet. She wrote 3 drafts before she was satisfied, which was more than she usually needed, because the balance she was trying to strike was a fine one. She needed to communicate enough knowledge to rattle him without revealing the specific documents she had. She needed to decline the meeting without closing the door so firmly that he shifted from pressure to something more dangerous. She needed to sound confident without sounding like someone who held all the cards, because a man who believed the game was already lost didn't meet you in a hotel in Billings. He removed you from the situation by other means. The letter she settled on was a page and a half. It acknowledged his message politely. It noted that she was aware of the nature of his legal challenge and had been assisting Mr. Mercer in preparing his response, which included documentation she believed the court in Helena would find relevant to the question of the transfer agreement's validity. It said she was not in a position to meet privately with a party adverse to her employer's interests, as this would be a conflict she was not prepared to entertain. It said she trusted he would understand that professional obligations sometimes superseded personal convenience. It wished him well in the coming legal proceedings. It did not mention Cascade Land Associates by name. It did not mention Garrett. It did not mention the registration date. But the phrase court in Helena would tell him that they had moved jurisdiction. The phrase the transfer agreement's validity would tell him they had found the forgery. And the phrase documentation she believed the court would find relevant would tell him they had something specific, without telling him what. She sealed it and left it on the hall table for Wyatt to post in the morning. Then she sat for a while in the quiet and thought about Colton Voss reading it and what he would do. What he did was send a man to the north fence 2 nights later. Harlow found evidence of it at first light: boot prints in the soft ground near the fence line, a section of wire that had been tested rather than cut, marks in the dirt suggesting someone had stood for a while and looked at the field and then left without doing anything, like someone taking measure. He reported it to Wyatt, who told Clara, who absorbed it and said nothing for a moment. "He's looking for leverage," she said. "Something to use before the Helena filing." "What kind of leverage?" Wyatt asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Which is the problem." She thought about it through the morning, about what Voss could use, about what she hadn't thought of. She was good at finding what was there, at reading the numbers and following the threads. But she was aware, with the particular humility of someone who had been surprised before, that she could miss things. That someone who had planned this for 2 years had probably thought of exits and contingencies she hadn't. The answer came, as answers sometimes did, not from thinking harder, but from stopping. She was nursing Lily after lunch, sitting in the chair by the window in her room, half watching the field through the glass, when it arrived fully formed in the way that things sometimes do when your brain has been working on them without your permission. The estate documents. Wyatt's father's estate transfer. The documents that proved clean title. They were in the strongbox in the study. She had copies, but the originals were there, and she had not thought carefully enough about the originals. She put Lily down and went to find Wyatt. "Wyatt, the estate documents in the strongbox," she said, finding him in the barn. "When did you last check them?" He turned from what he was doing. "When we went through them together, the night we found the forged transfer." "Have you opened the strongbox since?" A pause. "No." "Open it now," she said. He heard something in her voice. She could tell from the way he stopped what he was doing completely and came with her without asking more questions. They went to the study. He unlocked the strongbox with the key he kept on his person. The estate documents were there. The original water rights registration was there. Her copies of everything were there. The forged transfer agreement was not. Wyatt stared at the inside of the strongbox for a moment. He closed it, opened it again. The result was the same. "How?" he said. It came out almost without sound. Clara was already thinking. "The strongbox key," she said. "Is there another?" "There was a spare," he said, slowly. "My father's spare. It was in the desk drawer." She looked at the desk. The drawer was the one that closed properly, unlike the filing cabinet. She opened it. The usual contents: pencils, some papers, a folded map. She went through them carefully. No key. "Who's been in this room?" she asked. "Harlow, Pete, Cole, Irene. Anyone might have come through. I don't lock the study." Clara stood in the middle of the room and put it together. The man at the fence 2 nights ago, taking measure, looking, not at the fence at all, at the house, at where the lights were, figuring out when the study was empty. "He had someone come in and take it," she said, "to remove it from your possession so that when the hearing happens, The only copy of the forged transfer is in Voss's hands. Wyatt looked at her. We have your copies. Yes, she said. And in court, copies are worth less than originals. Hessing will argue the copy could have been altered. Without the original document, the one we could have had examined for forgery, we lose the ability to prove the signature is false. We're left with only the registration date argument. Is that enough? Wyatt asked. She thought about it honestly. It's strong, she said, but it's not as strong as both. And Hessing will know we had the original and no longer have it, which tells him someone on his side succeeded in removing it, which will make him bolder in the hearing. Wyatt sat down in the desk chair. He sat there for a moment with his hands on his knees. What do we do? He asked. We tell the Helena lawyer immediately, she said. We tell him what we had and what's been taken, and we tell him that the theft of the document itself is evidence. You don't steal a document that isn't dangerous to you. She paused. We also need Sheriff Blaine. Wyatt looked up. Blaine won't want to get involved. Blaine doesn't have to want to, Clara said. We need him to document the theft, officially. A sheriff's report of a stolen document from a locked strongbox, dated before the hearing, is something a judge cannot ignore. She met Wyatt's eyes. Voss removed the document because he thought it would weaken us. He didn't think about what the removal itself would say. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, in the deliberate way he made decisions. I'll ride to town and get Blaine, he said. Get him today, she said. Right now. He went. Sheriff Blaine was exactly as Irene had described. An honest man without much courage, which in Clara's experience was more common than either pure honesty or pure cowardice. He came to Silver Creek that afternoon with the air of someone who understood he was being pulled toward something he'd prefer to avoid, but had enough integrity not to refuse. He looked at the strongbox. He looked at the missing document as described by Wyatt's accounting of what had been there. He wrote it down in his report book with the conscientious thoroughness of a man covering himself, and Clara recognized that thoroughness was useful regardless of the motive behind it. Can't say who took it, Blaine said. No, Clara agreed. But you can say it was taken, and when, and from where. I can say that, he confirmed. Will you put in the report that the document in question was a transfer agreement that is the subject of current legal proceedings? She asked. Blaine looked at her. That's specific, he said. It's accurate, she said. He wrote it down. After he left, she sat in the kitchen with the sheriff's copy of the report in her hands and thought about what they had now. The certified registration from Helena. Fowler's affidavit, which had arrived that morning, notarized and exactly as she'd asked for. The legal opinion from Aldrich. The original estate documents. The sheriff's report documenting the theft of the forged transfer. The wire correspondence with the Helena lawyer. And now one more thing. The letter from Voss to her, which she had kept in the original envelope and which bore his name, his words, and the implication, however careful its phrasing, that he was aware of the legal proceedings and had reason to seek a private arrangement. She had been looking, for weeks, for something that put Voss's name directly on this. She had been frustrated by the gap, all the circumstantial connections, nothing direct. She looked at the letter in its envelope. It was not a confession, but it was a man who knew about the fraudulent proceedings reaching out directly to the person investigating them, offering what he called a reasonable arrangement. In the context of everything else, in front of a judge who had seen the full picture, it was the signature she'd been missing. Not proof of forgery, proof of consciousness of guilt. The letter of a man who knew what he'd built and was trying to stop it from being dismantled. She went to her room and unlocked the small case where she'd kept the letter since it arrived and looked at it for a moment. Then she added it to the package of documents she was preparing for Helena. She had been in Montana for 5 weeks. She had arrived with nothing, no plan, no connections, and a baby who was currently pulling herself upright against Irene's kitchen chair with the determined and slightly alarmed expression of someone discovering that standing was harder than it looked. She had found $400 in theft and exposed the man who'd committed it. She had traced a forged document through the impossible logic of its own dates and found the flaw that broke it open. She had built a paper case that a lawyer she'd never met was calling the most complete property fraud documentation he'd seen in 20 years of territorial law. She was not done. The hearing was in 2.5 weeks and things could still go wrong in ways she hadn't anticipated, because they always could. And she had learned not to count a thing as finished until it was finished. But she was close. She picked up Lily from the kitchen floor, where the experiment with vertical living had concluded temporarily in favor of sitting, and held her and looked out the kitchen window at the ranch, the fields and the fences and the creek. She could see a glimmer of in the low afternoon light. Irene was at the stove. Outside, Harlow was crossing the yard with the particular purposeful stride of a man with something to carry. Somewhere Wyatt was talking to Pete, who had asked to speak with him privately that morning. She didn't know what they'd said to each other, and she hadn't asked, because some things between men on a ranch needed to be settled between men on a ranch. She thought about Wyatt standing in the kitchen doorway saying, "I don't think that's what this is anymore." She had not given him an answer because she didn't have one yet. Or rather, she had something that might become an answer, and she didn't want to turn it into a decision before she'd had time to be sure it was real, rather than the result of circumstances pressing two people together. She had learned, in the past year, to be careful about that distinction. Lily grabbed her collar and looked at her with serious dark eyes. "I know," Clara said quietly. "One thing at a time. 2.5 weeks. She had work to do." The morning they left for Helena, it was cold enough that the water in the washing basin had a thin skin of ice on it. Clara broke it with her knuckle, washed her face, and stood at the mirror for a moment before she finished dressing. She looked tired. She was tired. She had been sleeping in 4- and 5-hour stretches for 2 weeks, waking in the early hours to go over the documents again. Not because she didn't have them memorized by now, but because going over them was the only thing that quieted the part of her brain that kept finding new ways things could go wrong. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair needed cutting, and she had worn the same 2 dresses in rotation since arriving at Silver Creek, and neither of them fit quite right anymore because she'd lost weight she hadn't had to spare. She looked at herself in the mirror and thought, this is what it looks like when you're actually doing something. Not the idea of it, the actual thing. She pinned her hair, put on her coat, and went downstairs. Irene had breakfast on the table, and Lily in the high chair that Wyatt had produced from somewhere in the back of the barn 3 weeks ago, saying only that it had been there a long time and might as well be used. Lily was eating mashed oats with the focused determination of someone who had recently discovered that feeding herself was possible and intended to pursue the skill regardless of the collateral mess. "You should eat," Irene said, setting a plate in front of the chair Clara usually took. "I know," Clara said, and sat down. Wyatt came in from outside, coat damp at the shoulders. He looked at Clara, and then at the plate in front of her, and back at Clara, in the way he'd developed of communicating a complete thought with his face when words were unnecessary. "I'll eat," she said. He sat down and poured his coffee, and they ate in the comfortable quiet that had become the texture of mornings at Silver Creek, punctuated by Lily occasionally offering a fistful of oats to no one in particular, and Irene moving efficiently between the stove and the table, and the general operational machinery of a household being managed by someone who took the job seriously. The Helena hearing was in 2 days. They were riding to Billings today to take the train, because the road to Helena in this weather was 3 days by horse, and they didn't have 3 days. Irene was keeping Lily. This had been decided the previous week, and Clara had agreed to it with the particular mixture of relief and guilt that attended any moment of leaving her daughter in someone else's care. Lily was 11 months old and had no conception of train schedules or court hearings or the legal architecture of property fraud, and a hearing room in Helena was no place for an almost 1-year-old, regardless of how much her mother might have preferred to keep her within reach. "She'll be fine," Irene said, for what was probably the 4th time in 3 days. She said it without looking up from the stove, which was how Irene communicated that something was settled and she expected no further discussion. "I know," Clara said. She did know. Lily had adopted Irene with the unconscious confidence of a baby who trusted her assessment of people, and her assessment of Irene had been settled since the first night, when Irene had taken her from Clara's arms in the doorway without hesitation. Whatever instinct babies use to measure the world, Lily's had been accurate. After breakfast, Clara went to the office one more time. She opened the leather case she'd prepared and went through the contents in order, which she had done every day for the past week. The certified registration from Helena, Fowler's notarized affidavit, the original estate documents, Aldrich's legal opinion, the sheriff's report, the copies of the ledger discrepancies with her written analysis, the wire correspondence with Wyatt's Helena lawyer, whose name was Gerald Marsh, and who had, in his last letter, used the phrase exceptionally well documented in a way that had made Clara close her eyes briefly and allow herself one moment of something that was not quite relief, but was in that direction. And at the back of the case, in its original envelope with Voss's precise handwriting on the front, the letter. She closed the case and latched it. She carried it to the front porch herself and did not let anyone else put it in the saddlebag. The train to Helena left Billings at 7 in the morning, which meant they spent the night at the Hargrove Hotel. Different rooms, which Clara had been prepared to navigate awkwardly, and which Wyatt had handled with complete matter-of-factness by booking 2 rooms and carrying her bag to her door and saying goodnight in the hallway with the same lack of ceremony he brought to everything. She lay awake in the hotel room for 2 hours, not from nerves exactly, but from the particular alertness that comes before something you've been building toward for a long time finally arrives. She thought about the documents in the case beside the bed. She thought about Marsh, whom she was meeting for the first time in the morning, and whether her read of his competence from his letters would hold in person. She thought about Hessing, Voss's lawyer, and what he would do when he saw what she'd assembled. She thought briefly and then firmly set aside the thing Wyatt had said in the kitchen doorway 3 weeks ago. She had been setting it aside consistently since he'd said it, because she needed to get through the hearing before she could afford to think about anything that lived on the other side of it. She fell asleep eventually. She woke at 5 and was dressed before 6. Gerald Marsh was a compact man in his mid-50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms where precise language mattered and had let it simplify his personality down to something functional and direct. He met them at his office at 8, already at his desk, and shook Clara's hand with no more or less ceremony than he shook Wyatt's. "I've read everything you sent," he said, "twice. Miss Whitmore, the analysis of the ledger discrepancies is the clearest document I've received from a lay investigator in my career at the bar. I mean that as a professional assessment, not a compliment." "I understand the distinction," Clara said. He almost smiled. "Good. Let's talk about tomorrow." They sat across from his desk and he walked them through the hearing structure. The counter motion had been accepted by the Helena court, which meant the water rights challenge was now under Helena jurisdiction rather than Billings. Hessing had filed an objection to the jurisdictional transfer, which Marsh had answered. The objection had been denied. "Hessing knows what that means," Marsh said. "He filed the challenge in Billings for a reason. Out of his home court, with a judge who doesn't have a history with Voss's operations, he's working from a weaker position." "Will Voss be there?" Clara asked. "He has no legal standing to appear," Marsh said. "He's not a named party. His company is Cascadeland Associates is the ostensible beneficiary of the transfer agreement. But Cascadeland Associates is a paper entity with one documented principal who is a man currently residing in Oregon who has not been subpoenaed and will not be present." "Garrett," Wyatt said. "Garrett," Marsh confirmed, "which means Hessing is arguing on behalf of a company whose only human principal is not here to testify. That's a structural weakness before we even open our evidence." "What's the order of presentation?" Clara asked. Marsh looked at her over his glasses. "I present the chain of title first, the estate documents, the original registration, the clean history of ownership. Then I present the transfer agreement and its defects. The registration date is the centerpiece. I'll use the certified Helena document to establish the impossibility, then support it with the Aldrich opinion on the legal implications." He paused. "The affidavit from Fowler and the letter from Voss to you are what I call the character evidence. They don't prove the document is forged, but they establish that the people involved in this had knowledge of what they were doing and tried to manage it privately when they believed it was unraveling." "Is the letter enough?" Clara asked. "It doesn't say anything specific about the transfer." "In isolation, no," Marsh said. "In context, following the registration date evidence, the Fowler affidavit, the sheriff's report about the stolen original, it is a man reaching out to the investigator who found his trail and offering her an arrangement. A judge reads that letter after seeing everything else, and he understands what it means." Clara nodded. This was what she had calculated. It was different, hearing it from someone else. "What does Hessing have?" Wyatt asked. Marsh took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "I don't know everything. He'll have the transfer document, the original, which we no longer have. He may have affidavits from people who claim to have witnessed the transaction, though fabricating witnesses is a considerable additional risk, and I'm not sure Voss would have taken it. He'll argue that the registration date is a clerical error, that the company existed in practice before formal registration, which is legally possible though evidentially difficult to establish without records. He put the glasses back on. His weakest point is that he has no explanation for why the company principal is absent. An entity claiming ownership of a water right through a 4-year-old transfer, and its principal doesn't appear to defend it. That tells a judge something. Can we win? Wyatt asked. Marsh looked at him directly. I believe the evidence supports a finding that the transfer agreement is invalid and that the challenge to your water rights should be dismissed, he said. Whether we win depends on tomorrow. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can tell you that courtrooms are not mathematics. I can tell you our case is strong. I cannot tell you the result. Wyatt nodded once. That's honest, he said. It's the only kind I do, Marsh said. The night before the hearing, Clara and Wyatt ate dinner at a restaurant near the hotel that was plain and adequate and almost empty on a Tuesday. They talked about the hearing for a while and then, by unspoken agreement, stopped talking about it. There was nothing more to prepare. The preparation was done. Wyatt asked about her life in Boston. Not the collapse of it, which they had talked around for weeks, but the earlier part, the part before. She told him about the accounting work, the 2 merchants she'd worked for, the manufacturing firm. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 19 and left her with a sister she wasn't close to, and an aunt who was generous in the particular way of people who want their generosity noticed. She told him she had been good at school in a time when being good at school, if you were a girl, mostly just made people suggest teaching. He listened the way he always listened, with the full attention of someone who was not waiting for his turn to speak. What about you? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Grew up at Silver Creek, he said. My father built it. I grew up thinking that was what you did. You built something, and then you kept it. Didn't think much about whether I wanted something different. Do you? She asked. Want something different? I thought I didn't, he said. I thought the ranch was enough. After a while it stops being enough, and you can't say that to anyone because you're the man who's supposed to be keeping it together, and saying it out loud sounds like failing. Clara looked at him across the table. He was looking at his hands. It doesn't sound like failing, she said. It sounds like being a person. He looked up at her. The restaurant was quiet around them, and the light was low, and she thought about what it cost him to say that. Not the words, which were few, but the admission behind them, coming from a man who had been alone with his land and his responsibility for a long time. I know I said I needed to figure out what to do about you, he said, after this is over. You did say that. I meant it seriously, he said, not as... He stopped. I'm not good at this part. I know, she said. I want you to stay, he said. Not because you're useful, though you are. Not because Lily's become part of the place, though she has. He stopped again with the expression of a man pushing through something that resisted. Because when I come in from the field, and you're at the desk in the office, the ranch feels like a different thing than it did before. And I don't know what to do with that except say it. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the things she should think about. The question of whether she was making a decision out of circumstance, out of gratitude, out of the particular closeness that comes from facing something difficult alongside someone. She had thought about these things for weeks. She had been careful and honest with herself about them in the way she tried to be careful and honest about everything. And what she came back to each time was simpler than the thinking. She trusted him, not because he had taken her in from the rain, which anyone decent would have done, but because he had given her the office and the ledgers and the space to find what was there, and because when she'd found it, he'd listened and then said, "What do you need from me?" And because in 5 weeks of being in each other's company, daily, he had never once made her feel that her being there was conditional on her being something other than exactly what she was. She had not had that before. She hadn't known how much she'd been missing it. I want to stay, she said. I'm being careful about saying it because I've made decisions out of necessity before, and I don't want this to be one of them. But I've been thinking about it honestly, and I don't think it is. He looked at her steadily. All right, he said. All right, she said. They finished their dinner and walked back to the hotel through the cold Helena street and said goodnight in the corridor as practically as they had the night before, because there was a hearing in the morning and some things could wait until the other side of it. The hearing room was smaller than Clara had expected. She had been imagining something more imposing, the kind of high-ceilinged formal space that announced the gravity of what happened inside it. What she got was a wood-paneled room with tall windows that let in the gray morning light, and two long tables facing a raised bench where the judge would sit, and the smell of paper and wood oil, and the particular staleness of a room that was closed most of the time. Judge Carver was already at the bench when they came in. He was older than she'd expected from Irene's description, late 70s, with the compressed stillness of a man who had spent decades watching people try to deceive him and had developed a fine instrument for detecting it. He had a long face and eyes that moved across the room with the measuring economy of someone who did not look at things without purpose. Irene had written to Carver 3 weeks ago. He had not responded to Irene, but he had, Marsh had told them this morning, requested from the court a full copy of the documentation in the case before today's session, which was unusual. It meant he had read what they had before he walked into the room. Hessing was already at the opposing table. Clara had not seen him before. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-40s, well-dressed, with the poised confidence of a man who believed that confidence was itself a form of argument. He looked at Wyatt and then at Clara with the flat assessment of someone cataloging threats. He did not look at her the way men usually looked at her, with the dismissal or the wariness or the particular evaluation of a woman in a room where women were uncommon. He looked at her the way a lawyer looked at evidence he was trying to find a problem with. She took that as information. It meant he knew who she was and what she'd assembled. Voss would have told him. Good. She wanted him looking at her. She wanted him thinking about her rather than about something she hadn't accounted for. Marsh set out his papers with the orderly efficiency of a man who had done this hundreds of times. He did not look nervous. Clara had been watching him since yesterday to try to calibrate whether his confidence was real or performed, and she had decided it was real in the way that competence was real, grounded in something actual rather than in the need to appear settled. She sat beside Wyatt at the table and put her hands in her lap and was still. Judge Carver called the session to order without ceremony, noted the matter and the parties, and indicated that he had reviewed the submitted documentation from both sides. He said this with a particular flatness that told Clara nothing, and she had been trying all morning not to try to read things into nothing. Marsh opened. He was good. She had thought so from his letters, and she confirmed it now. He told the story of Silver Creek's water rights in the clean, sequential way of someone who understood that a judge hearing a complex case needed the shape of the thing before he could evaluate the details. He established the original registration, the estate transfer, the clean chain of ownership, without hurry and without unnecessary detail. He was giving the judge the architecture before showing him where the load-bearing wall had been tampered with. Then he turned to the transfer agreement. He presented it as Voss's side had filed it, as a document purporting to transfer a 1/3 interest in Silver Creek's water rights to Cascade Land Associates 4 years ago. He read the date. He allowed the date to sit in the room for a moment. Then he presented the certified Helena registration. He read the registration date. He placed both documents on the bench before the judge. He said, in the level and precise voice of a man stating a mathematical fact, the company to which this transfer was allegedly made did not exist on the date the transfer was allegedly executed. The registration of Cascade Land Associates postdates the transfer agreement by more than 2 years. Hessing objected. He used the word clerical 3 times. He argued that a company could exist in practice before formal registration. He was composed and fluent, and Clara could see that he had prepared for this. He had known about the registration date, which meant Voss had known they'd found it. Judge Carver listened to Hessing's argument without expression. Then he said, "Do you have documentation of the company's practical existence prior to formal registration?" Hessing said he had affidavits from 2 individuals who had conducted business with Cascade Land Associates prior to the registration date. Marsh requested to examine the affidavits. The judge granted it. Marsh spent 4 minutes reading them and then, with the unhurried manner of a man who had been expecting this, presented Garrett's registration documents showing him as the entity's creator, combined with the ledger analysis showing the fabricated Silver Creek service entry, $48 to Cascade Land Associates, dated 2 months before Hessing's affidavits claimed to have conducted business with the company. The only documented transaction involving this entity prior to formal registration, Marsh said, is a fabricated entry in Silver Creek's own books, created by a man who is also the company's registered principal, who was placed at Silver Creek Ranch by Mr. Voss himself, as attested to in a sworn affidavit from a third-party witness, and who has since left the territory. Hessing objected again. He was still composed, but the quality of his composure had changed. It was the composure of someone working harder to maintain it. Judge Carver said, "Noted. Continue." Marsh presented Fowler's affidavit. He presented the Aldrich legal opinion. He presented the sheriff's report on the theft of the original transfer document from a locked strongbox, dated 2 weeks before the hearing. Then he presented the letter. He read it aloud, in full, without editorial comment. Voss's precise handwriting rendered in Marsh's measured voice, offering a productive conversation and reasonable arrangements to the woman who had been investigating the fraud on Wyatt's behalf. The room was quiet when he finished. Hessing said, "That letter is an entirely normal attempt at private dispute resolution and implies no wrongdoing." Marsh said, "The court can evaluate that characterization in the context of the full record." Judge Carver looked at the letter. He looked at the registration document. He looked at Hessing. "Mr. Hessing," he said, "your client's company is claiming ownership of a water right through a transfer agreement dated 2.5 years before the company existed. You've offered affidavits of prior business dealings that were executed within months of the company's actual registration, from individuals whose identities I will be verifying. The registered principal of your client company is absent, and you have a sheriff's report indicating that the original transfer document, the one you would presumably use to support your client's claim, was removed from the respondent's property prior to this hearing." He paused. "What would you like me to conclude from these facts?" Hessing did not answer immediately. Clara watched him and understood that he was a capable lawyer in an impossible position. He had been handed a fraudulent case by a client who had believed it was untouchable, and the moment the registration date had been confirmed, the case had collapsed from the inside. "Your Honor," Hessing said, "my client has instructed me to—" He stopped. He said it again. "My client has instructed me to withdraw the challenge." The room was quiet. Judge Carver looked at him for a moment. "The challenge is withdrawn," he said. "I am additionally referring the matter of the transfer agreement and the circumstances described in this record to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review. The water rights of Silver Creek Ranch are confirmed as registered and unencumbered." He set down his pen. "We're adjourned." It lasted 11 minutes from Marsh's opening to the gavel. Clara sat at the table for a moment after the room began to empty, her hands still in her lap. Wyatt was beside her. Marsh was already gathering papers with the calm efficiency of a man closing out a completed project. Hessing left without looking at either of them. Wyatt put his hand over hers on the table. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. There didn't seem to be anything that needed saying immediately, and they had both learned, over weeks of working alongside each other, that not filling silence was sometimes the most honest response to it. After a moment, she turned her hand over under his. They stayed like that for a little while, in the emptying room with the winter light coming through the tall windows, and Clara let herself feel the full weight of the past 5 weeks. The train station in the rain, the first night at Silver Creek, the ledgers and the letters and the long hours in the office while Lily slept in the corner, the stolen document and the fence line and the cold rides and the things Wyatt had said in kitchen doorways and at dinner tables. And she did not try to make it into something neat or resolved or more than it was. It was hard, and it was real, and they had gotten through it. That was the whole thing. That was enough. There is something nobody tells you about surviving a hard year. It doesn't end cleanly. There's no moment where the music swells and everything settles into its right shape, and you feel certain. What actually happens is you get through the hard thing, and then you're standing on the other side of it, still yourself, still imperfect, still carrying the weight of every decision you've made, and the next day comes, and you start again. Clara knew this. She had known it before Montana, had learned it the hard way in Boston in the year Lily was born, when she had survived one day at a time and each day felt like starting from nothing. What she hadn't known, what she was learning now, slowly, in the particular way that things take time to become real, was that surviving could change its texture over time, that it could become something less like holding on and more like building. She was thinking about this on the train back to Billings, watching the territory move past the window in the flat winter light, with Wyatt reading beside her and the leather case with the documents in the rack above them, when she understood something she hadn't been able to see clearly before. She had not come to Montana to find a husband. She had not come to find a ranch or a purpose or a new life. She had come because she had no alternative, because she had burned the telegram and gotten on the train and refused to go back. She had arrived with nothing, less than nothing, with negative expectations, prepared to manage on her own because managing on her own was the only skill she was certain she had. What she had found instead was that managing on her own, in the right circumstances, alongside the right person, was not the same thing as being alone. She had always been competent. She had known that about herself even in the worst months. She was good at the work, good at finding what was there, good at the patient, unglamorous labor of making sense of disordered things. What she hadn't had was a place where that competence was simply accepted, without needing to be justified or explained or apologized for. Where she could walk into an office and open a ledger and someone would let her work and trust what she found. That was what Silver Creek had given her, not rescue, not charity. Permission to be exactly what she already was. She did not think she would have found it if Ethan Caldwell had been at the station. If she had arrived to the life she'd planned, the arranged marriage, the conventional frontier arrangement, the practical compact between strangers, she would have been useful in the way women were useful in those arrangements, and no more. She would have managed and been decent and built a life that was acceptable. She would not have had this. There was something uncomfortable in that thought. The idea that the worst thing that had happened to her, the abandonment, the rain, the ruined dress, the desperate choice to get back on a stranger's horse in the dark, had led here. She did not want to believe that suffering was necessary, that humiliation was a useful teacher, that you had to lose everything to find the right thing. She had seen that used too many times to excuse too much. But she could believe this, that who you were when you had nothing was the truest version of what you had. And who she had been, standing on that platform in the storm with $17 and a baby and no plan, was someone who broke the telegram and got on the train. Someone who said, "I'm not looking for charity," and meant it. Someone who opened a ledger and kept reading until the numbers told the truth. That person had not been made by Montana. She had brought her here. She was still thinking about this, more quietly now, when the train pulled into Billings in the late afternoon and they rode back to Silver Creek in the cold, arriving after dark to find the house lit from inside and the smell of something in the oven and Lily awake past her bedtime, sitting in Irene's lap in the front room with an expression of absolute satisfaction at the extended evening. Lily saw Clara come through the door and made a sound that was almost a word. Not quite, not yet, but the shape of one, urgent and pleased, and reached out both arms. Clara took her and held her and stood in the warm hallway of the house and felt the small, heavy weight of her daughter against her chest and thought, here, this is the place. What happened after that was not a single moment, but a series of ordinary ones. The Territorial Attorney's Office opened an investigation into Colton Voss and the matter of Cascade Land Associates that winter. Garrett was located in Oregon and subpoenaed. He cooperated, as men who have been made instruments of someone else's scheme often do when the alternative is bearing the full weight of it alone. Voss denied everything, and then when Garrett's testimony was entered into the record, denied it differently, and then when the certified documents and Fowler's affidavit were entered, instructed his new lawyer, Hessing had withdrawn, to explore what arrangements might be possible. The arrangements that were possible involved a significant financial settlement with Wyatt, the formal withdrawal of all claims on Silver Creek's water rights in perpetuity, and the transfer of the 10 cattle that had been moved off the property in the night raid, now converted to their market value. Voss did not go to prison, which was the frustrating and entirely predictable outcome of being a man with resources in a territory where the law moved slowly and the rich had more options than the poor. But his operations were curtailed, his reputation among the neighboring ranches was destroyed, and within a year he had sold a substantial portion of his land and moved east. Clara knew this was not justice in the complete sense. She had been around enough commerce and law in Boston to understand that complete justice was rare and partial justice was what you usually got, and learning to live with the distance between them was one of the harder adult skills. She accepted it the way she accepted most things, directly, without making it more or less than it was. Pete left Silver Creek in the spring. He had stayed through the winter, and his behavior had changed enough that Wyatt had let him. But it was an uneasy stay for everyone. And when Pete came to say he'd found a position on a ranch near Great Falls, Wyatt shook his hand and said he hoped it went well and meant it, which Clara thought was generous and correct. Pete was not a bad man who had done a bad thing. He was a young man who had been used by someone who understood his resentments and knew how to aim them. He would have to live with his part in it. That was consequence enough. Harlow stayed. He had been at Silver Creek long enough that leaving would have required a reason, and he didn't have one. He became, over the following year, one of Clara's more reliable allies in the daily operation of the ranch, not because he was demonstrative about it, but because he showed up when something needed doing and didn't require management. Clara appreciated this more than she could have articulated. Irene stayed, which was never a question. Silver Creek without Irene was not something any of them had imagined, and none of them tested. The accounting system Clara had built in her first week ran cleanly through the following year and the year after that. She added to it as the ranch grew, a second cattle operation to the south, a working arrangement with 2 neighboring ranchers for shared fence maintenance that required its own tracking, an expansion of the winter feed contracts that she renegotiated herself after, discovering the existing terms were unfavorable. She did all of this from the office that had been given to her on the second day, sitting at the same desk, working by the same lamp, and the work was not glamorous, and no one who didn't understand it would have been impressed by it, which suited her exactly. She was not a figurehead. She was not Wyatt's wife in the decorative sense that some frontier marriages produced. She was the person who knew where the money was and where it was going and what to do about it when those two things didn't align. And she was respected for this in the slow, grudging way that people respect competence they didn't expect. Not everyone on the frontier accepted it. Some men who came to do business at Silver Creek looked past her to Wyatt and addressed their questions to him. And Wyatt would look back at them and say, "Clara manages the accounts. You'll want to talk to her." And some of them did, and some of them left, and the ones who left didn't come back, which Clara considered an efficient sorting mechanism. She married Wyatt the following summer, not in a ceremony with a dress. She had retired the wedding dress permanently after its appearance at the billing station, and the symbolism of wearing another one so soon felt wrong, or at least overcrowded. They went to town on a Tuesday with Irene and Harlow as witnesses and signed the documents before a justice of the peace, and came home, and Irene made a dinner that was notably better than the usual Tuesday dinner, and that was the whole of it. It was not the wedding Clara had imagined when she was young, in the way all young women imagined weddings before reality taught them that weddings were 1 hour of their lives and marriages were everything else. It was not romantic in the performed way of stories. What it was real. 2 people who had spent a year learning each other's flaws and capabilities and silences and had decided separately and then together that this was the shape they wanted their lives to take. She thought her mother would have approved. Not of the circumstances. Her mother had been a practical woman who would have had several pointed things to say about the train and the telegram and the ruined dress, but of the result. Of the specific quality of a life built from honest material. Lily turned 1 that winter, and then 2, and then 3, with the speed that children accomplish these things when the adults around them are too occupied to properly notice. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and increasingly, an attachment to the horses that Wyatt encouraged, and Clara observed with the complicated emotions of a mother watching her daughter become interested in something that was genuinely dangerous and genuinely wonderful. By the time Lily was 4, she could identify all the cattle by their markings, and had strong opinions about which of the barn cats was superior. By the time she was 5, she was accompanying Wyatt on the short fence rides, and sitting in front of him on the horse with the specific satisfaction of a child who had been included in something that mattered. She would grow up knowing that her mother had arrived in Montana with nothing. She would know the story in pieces, gathered from overheard conversations and Irene's occasional direct storytelling and her own questions as she grew old enough to have them. She would understand eventually that the life she lived at Silver Creek had not been inevitable, that it had been built, piece by piece, from decisions her mother had made under pressure in a series of rooms and fields and a courthouse and a hotel dining room in Helena. What she might not fully understand, until she was much older and had her own hard years, was what those decisions had cost. What it had taken to stand in the rain in a ruined dress and say, "I am not looking for charity." What it had taken to open a stranger's ledgers and keep reading until the truth came up. What it had taken to write a letter to a powerful man and say, "I'm not coming to your meeting," and mean it. The cost is always invisible from the outside. The outcome is what people see. Clara knew this. She had always known it. She had done the work anyway, not because it was easy or because she was certain it would matter, but because the alternative was to stop, and stopping had never been something she was able to do. There are people in this world who, when the worst thing happens, find a way to make the next decision. Not the right decision always, not the perfect one, not the one they'll look back on without regret, just the next one, and then the one after that. And they keep making them, imperfectly and tired and afraid, until they look up one day and find that the accumulation of small, ordinary decisions has made something they hadn't planned for and couldn't have imagined from the rain-soaked platform where they started. That is not a story about luck, though luck is always part of it. It is not a story about being exceptional, though there are exceptional people in it. It is a story about what happens when you refuse, even when you have every reason to give up, to put the baby down and sit in the rain and wait for someone else to come along and decide your life for you. Clara Whitmore had not been rescued. She had arrived in the middle of a storm with nothing and had done the next thing, and the thing after that. And somewhere in the long middle of all those ordinary days, Silver Creek had become home, not because it was given to her, because she had made it one.